Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. And comment, where are you watching from and the time you are watching this video. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. I'm a police officer that quit his job after a paranormal experience. I'm not a superstitious person. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons until now. Yeah, stuff happens that can't be explained. But I just want you all to know that it took more than a couple of flying spoons or a door opening on its own to scare me out of my job. Since the department didn't find any reason to keep this police report confidential, I will now detail you everything I can on what happened on the scariest night of my life. We had just received word from dispatch to check out a noise complaint in a small neighborhood, whose name I will not disclose for their privacy. It was me and my partner. Let's call him Paul, and I'll go by Mike. We arrived sometime after midnight. The street is dead. Everyone is sound asleep at this point. We park our patrol car in front of the aforementioned house and exit the vehicle. We knock on the door and let our presence known. Police. Is anyone home? A little girl, 8 to 10 in appearance, opens the door and peeks through the gap. Hey! I crouch to make myself less intimidating. Is your parent or guardian home? She shakes her head. My first thought was that she probably had the TV a little too high and woke up the neighbors. But before I could tell her to stay inside and lock the doors, then part, I heard the sound of crashing silverware coming from what I presumed would be the kitchen. The entire house was nearly pitch black. The girl answering the door and shaking her head let me know she was alone, which makes whoever made that noise an intruder as far as it concerns me. I asked the girl to step outside and turn to Paul. Paul, why don't you give her one of those lollipops you like to suck on when you're nervous? Paul gave me a cold stare as the girl giggled. They went to go wait by the car as I slowly pushed the door all the way open. Police? If there is anyone in this house, please let yourself be known. Without a warrant, I had no right to enter the building. I tried my best to spot whoever made the noise, but it is too dark to see. Just any sign of a threat, and I would be justified to search the house. But nothing. I left the door open and headed back towards Paul and the girl. Hey again. I don't think we introduced ourselves. I'm Officer Mike. This is my partner, Paul. If I may ask, what is your name? Maribel. That's a pretty name. So Maribel, again, if I may ask, where is your family? As soon as I had finished my sentence, the television in the living room turned on, volume fully up. Me and Paul quickly turned in surprise and could see the television playing static from outside. We put Maribel in the back seat of the patrol car for her safety, as no civilians were allowed in the front seats. We then, against our better judgment, enter the house. We tried every switch in the house, but no lights came on. While wandering the house cautiously, I would catch a person standing in the mirrors. I thought it was Paul, but every time I looked behind me, Paul was nowhere to be found. As I returned to the front door along with Paul, we both jumped as running footsteps echoed down the hall. We detached our firearms and aimed it at the source. The footsteps got louder and got closer, but no one ever appeared physically. Lamps, chairs, and other stuff started getting thrown around by an invisible force as the footsteps reached us. We sprinted out of the house and waited by the front yard. The footsteps seemed to stop, followed by the police siren that went off. I ran to the car and silenced the siren. I looked back at Paul, who seemed shocked. You all right, Paul? He takes a lollipop out of its package and puts it in his mouth. Yep. I opened the rear door and checked up on Maribel. You okay? She nodded her head, so I walked back to Paul. I don't know what to make of this, he said. Yeah, me neither. No, seriously, ignore the running invisible man that knocked everything down for a second. All the family photos, pictures on the wall. He points at Maribel. She's not in any of them. So what are you thinking? The footsteps led outside, then the siren goes off. There's a million buttons in that car. What are the chances? Paul? Are you trying to tell me that Maribel is haunted? How do you explain what we just saw? I'm sure there's an explanation. The TV turns on when we take Maribel outside, prompting us to check it out. Someone or something shows up in the mirrors, but ducks away. I remember wanting to shut him up, not because he wasn't making any sense, but because he was. I know you've seen it. It was prowling around. Then it runs outside and gets in the car. Tries all the buttons. I think a ghost is trying to get to the girl. I just stood there, not sure what to say, until Paul decided to start walking back towards the house. Paul, what are you doing? It only shows up in the mirrors. That's how we find it. I followed him inside and watched as he takes a book from the counter and breaks the nearest mirror. What's the matter with you? That's someone's property. He takes a shard and hands another to me. It's not every day you get to arrest a ghost. We aimed our flashlights all over the house, waiting for something to appear in the broken glass. I recall praying to God Almighty to not let anything show up, but it did. I panicked as it swung its red bony arm at my back. It ripped right through my uniform, causing me to fall forward. I dropped the glass, which broke into smaller chunks. It continued clawing at my shirt and flesh, but stopped when Paul opened fire. I heard it screech, fading as Paul helped me up. We both then hurried back outside to find Maribel missing from the back seat. It was difficult explaining what happened to the department without sounding like nut jobs. The police cameras, who we were betting on to prove our stories, had shut off the moment we entered the house. The thing, whatever it was, must have turned them off while we were unaware. The only part of our story that our police captain took seriously was the girl Maribel. The captain brought up a missing person report and asked us if this was the girl we saw. It was. It's been just a few days since I gave up the badge to save whatever little pride I could spare. I just ask to whoever reads this and to whomever it may reach. The next time a door opens on its own or things move by themselves in your home, check the mirrors. As one nightmare fades, another takes its place. My mom has always been a neat freak, but lately she's taken it too far. My mother has always been overly obsessed with cleaning, and I'm not just talking about the house. I mean everything. Her car, my clothes, the insides of her ears. Hell, even the cat gets a thorough scrubbing at least once a week. Mom's fixation on cleaning has always been a bit of a thorn in my side, but it used to be somewhat manageable. Now, I'm downright terrified of what it's done to my mother. Mom, please, let me help you with this. You've had a long day. No, Mom replied, refusing to take her eyes off the spot she was scrubbing on the kitchen floor. You're not thorough enough. You know that. I sighed. It was a very blunt way to put it, but she wasn't wrong. Mom expected each tile to be absolutely spotless, and I just didn't have the time nor the dedication to make that happen. Still, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little bummed out about it. All I wanted was to spend a little quality time with her, even if it meant relentlessly cleansing the already pristine floors. Okay, I'll be up in my room then, I said, heading for the stairs. I still don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was due to frustration or resentment or a primal need for attention. Maybe it was a mix of the three. What I do know is that what I said next was the catalyst for Mom's downward spiral. It doesn't matter how clean the house is. It won't make Dad come back home. Instant regret washed over me the moment the words left my lips. Mom froze, staring holes into the shimmering tile before her. Her eyes began to water, and a deep sense of guilt settled into my stomach. I know. A long, tense silence followed. My brain scrambled for the right words to say, anything to fix what I'd done. But each time I opened my mouth to speak, the apology died on my tongue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I finally squeaked out, tears welling in my own eyes. Mom didn't respond. She just continued solemnly scrubbing away at stains that I couldn't see, acting as if I'd never said anything at all. Mom was different after that incident, more closed off. Before, when I would come home from school, she would take a moment to greet me and ask how my day was. I always looked forward to that. Now, she doesn't give me so much as a wave. And to top it all off, Mom's daily cleaning spree escalated from intense to out of control. She started vehemently cleansing everything in the house 2 days ago, and she hasn't stopped since. I first noticed it when I arrived home from class. The moment I walked through the door yesterday, Mom was on me, like white on rice. She snatched the backpack from my grasp and began furiously wiping it down. Good to see you too, Mom. She didn't reply, her eyes laser-focused on my bag. Honestly, she was beginning to frighten me. I knew that what I'd said had struck a nerve, but I didn't think Mom was petty enough to ignore me entirely. Yes, I screwed up. but I didn't deserve to be shunned. Mom didn't bother making dinner that evening. She was too busy running my clothes through the wash for the 4th time that day. It was as if Mom thought I had some kind of infectious disease, and the only way to prevent it from spreading was to clean my belongings like there was no tomorrow. I decided to try my best to ignore it. Surely, after enough time, Mom would return to her normal self. She had to, right? I wanted to believe that, but I really didn't know. So, I figured it couldn't hurt to buy her something to show how sorry I was. After all, Mom was always a sucker for gifts. The next day on my way home from school, I made a little detour. I stopped off at a local florist, and I bought the prettiest bouquet of roses that my jobless teenage self could afford. As basic as it is, red roses are Mom's favorites. I grinned like the Cheshire Cat the entire walk home, eagerly awaiting Mom's response to my present. I sauntered through the door, armed with my random expression of kindness, and I marched straight up to my mother. She was busy dusting the tops of the kitchen cabinets, so she didn't see me right away. "Mom, I'm home." Silence. She didn't even turn to look at me. I sighed. I didn't want it to have to come to this. "Mom, I bought you something," I shouted, waving the flowers in what I hoped was her peripheral vision. That did the trick. "Oh, hello, honey. I didn't hear you come in. Are those for me?" she asked, exaggeratedly placing her hand over her heart. "Yep, I wanted to apologize for a couple days ago. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry." I could feel hot tears stinging at my eyes. I may have had to stoop as low as to buy my mother's love, but my apology was genuine. "It's okay, Gemma. I know you didn't mean it," Mom said, hopping down from the counter and wrapping me in a massive bear hug. "I won't lie. I may have shed a tear or two. I'd really needed that." Mom smiled warmly at me when she finally pulled away. My heart swelled with relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like things were going to be okay. How wrong I was. I watched as Mom's gaze broke from mine and fell to the roses still clutched between my fingers. Her welcoming visage melted, and a deep frown replaced her affectionate grin. "Sweetie, the thorns. You're bleeding." I glanced down, and sure enough, she was right. A small rivulet of crimson was traveling from the back of my hand down to my wrist. I must have been so caught up in the moment that I didn't feel it. "Let me clean that up for you. We wouldn't want it dripping onto the floor now, would we?" Mom said, snatching a wet rag from the sink. I placed the bouquet onto the counter and began backing away. No, Mom, it's fine, really. I'll just go to the bathroom. And nonsense. I'll take care of it. Let me see." "Mom, it's okay. I can handle it." "Gemma, let me see it." Mom gritted her teeth and clutched the rag so tightly that a few droplets of sink water fell to the floor. "All right," I said, hoping not to anger her any further. "That's a good girl," Mom replied, snatching my wrist. She began rubbing ferociously, wiping at the bloody spot like it was a deadly virus that needed to be eradicated. I released a weak whimper as she continued, unrelenting. "Mom, stop. That hurts," I whined, tugging against her grip. "Just a little bit more." "No, let go of me," I shouted, ripping my arm away. I glanced down at my hand to find that Mom had only made it worse. My skin stung, and I could tell that the abrasion had spread as a direct result of Mom's obsessive cleansing. "Get back over here. I wasn't done yet," Mom ordered, advancing toward me. I hesitantly met her stare, and my heart dropped. Mom's eyes were wild. They looked hungry, predatory, like a rabid animal ready to tear into its prey. I slowly backed into the hallway. I didn't know what to do. I had never seen her like that before. "Mom, please, you're scaring me." My voice sounded so brittle. In that moment, I felt like a scared, defenseless little girl again. And that terrified me. "Oh, honey, there's nothing to be afraid of. Mommy won't hurt you. Just come here, and I can make all the pain go away." For a second, Mom's manic expression faded. I could sense the nurturing, loving parent that I once knew. I almost returned to her. But then she lunged for me. I sidestepped her and bolted for the stairs. I could hear her screaming at me all the while. "Come here, you disrespectful little shit. I will not tolerate this kind of behavior. You get your ass back down here now, young lady. If I have to come up there, mark my words, you will regret it." Tears trickled down my cheeks as I flew up the steps and locked myself in my room. I shoved my dresser in front of the door, barricading myself inside. I had never seen Mom in such a volatile state, and I had no idea what she was capable of. That's where I am now. I didn't want it to have to come to this, but I think I'm going to have to call the police. My heart is racing as I type this out. And to make matters worse, I found a letter where my dresser had been. I think someone wanted me to find it. My name had been hastily scrawled across the front, and it looked old. With trembling hands, I opened the letter and read its contents. Gemma, I'm sorry for doing this to you and your mother. I love you more than anything in the entire world, but I couldn't stay with her any longer. I'm a coward for that, but I had to leave for my own safety. This may sound insane, but you need to know. A few years after you were born, we were both in a dark place. I was drinking heavily, and your mother had turned to the occult. She ended up being possessed by a demonic entity. It reacts to the sight of blood. Whatever you do, never show her if you're bleeding. It will send her into a manic frenzy. Please stay safe and know that I will always love you. Yours, Dad. I wish I would have found the letter sooner. It might be too late for me now. Because I can smell potent cleaning chemicals and bleach wafting through the cracks in the door, and Mom is calling in a sickly sweet voice. Gemma, please come out. I don't mean any harm. All I want is to scrub all that filthy flesh and blood away from your bones. Just when we thought the terror was over, a new darkness emerged. I had an imaginary friend in childhood, but lately, I've started seeing him again. When I was a little girl, I had an imaginary friend. I called him Mr. Paperbag. 4 years old, I moved with my parents to a small town in Connecticut. I didn't have any friends there, and my parents couldn't accompany me because of busy work. I was lonely, and then I started imagining some non-existent partners. That's when Mr. Paperbag appeared. He was tall and always wore a black suit. I couldn't see his face because he had a linen paper bag on his head. And that's why I called him Mr. Paperbag. There were 2 holes in the paper bag. I guess Mr. Paperbag was looking at me through the holes, but I couldn't see his eyes through them. Mr. Paperbag never talks, but he was willing to play every game with me, even the stupid ones. He stayed with me for many years. Even after I entered elementary school, I could still see him. When I played games with my friends in school, I could sometimes see him standing alone in the corner, but he never interrupted me. As I grew older, my life was full of new things. There were more friends around me, so gradually I no longer needed Mr. Paperbag. And one day, he just disappeared. I know it's common to have an imaginary friend in childhood, especially if you're the only child in the family and your parents are busy at work. What I want to say is that several years later, I started seeing Mr. Paperbag again. After graduating from college, my parents divorced and started their own families. I was thrown back into loneliness. Fortunately, I met Will, the man who makes me think that worthy of entrusting my life to. We rented a small apartment and worked hard, hoped to save enough money to get married. A few days ago, I was walking home alone after finishing my shift at night. As I was walking through an alley, I felt someone was watching me from behind. I looked back reflexively, but no one was there. However, the feeling of being peeped was so obvious that it made my skin crawl. I became more alert, paying close attention to the sounds around me, but except for my footsteps, everything was dead silent. Suddenly, a cat screamed from behind me, which scared me half to death. I turned around immediately and found a vague figure in the dim light. Even though it has been many years, I still recognized it was Mr. Paperbag, or maybe just a pervert disguised as that. I quickened my pace and secretly prayed him would not catch up with me. Fortunately, nothing happened. "Do you feel like here's someone else?" While eating breakfast, Will asked. "No? Why?" I asked as I drank my coffee. "I don't know. I thought I saw someone when I went to the bathroom last night." Will was confused. "Have you checked around?" I suddenly remembered the weird man I met. "Yes, but found nothing," Will answered. "Maybe we are overreacting." I smiled and kissed him, then went out to work. I saw that weird man again, this time in our apartment. When I got up in the middle of the night to drink water, I saw him in the kitchen. I screamed immediately, but no sound came out of my throat, as if someone had choked me or taken the sound out of my mouth. My body was frozen in place. But it's not, I don't want to move. I can't. The man slowly walked towards me, pointing at a knife on the counter. I tried to see his eyes through the hole in the paper bag, but all I saw was darkness. I closed my eyes and accepted my fate helplessly. That was the only thing I could do. Suddenly, the light was turned on. I opened my eyes again, and the weird man had disappeared. "What are you doing, Han?" Will asked worriedly. I cried in Will's arms, telling him over and over that I had just seen someone in the kitchen. "So where did he go?" Will asked. I shook my head, because I didn't see it. Will checked the apartment but still found nothing, so we called the police, but they didn't find any signs of intrusion. In the next few days, I always woke up in the middle of the night, fearing that the weird man would appear again. Tonight, I was woken by some rustling noises, and when I opened my eyes, Will was standing next to me. And he had a knife. I was so scared that I sat up immediately. Will didn't give me a chance to escape. He raised the knife and prepared to stab me. "I'm sorry, but I have to do this for her." This was Will's last words. He hadn't no intention of stopping what he was doing. However, his face suddenly twisted, as if he was in great pain. Then his arms were folded behind his back in an extremely exaggerated manner by an invisible force. The knife in his hand also fell to the ground. Only then did I realize that the weird man had appeared again. Will began to burn, but no flame here. His body was just gradually charred in the air, accompanied by the smell of meat being cooked. At last, Will disappeared. Yes, not even a bone was left, just a pile of ashes on the floor. "Mr. Paper Bag?" I asked the man. He didn't say anything, just took off the paper bag on his head. I finally saw his face. It was burned beyond recognition. I wasn't scared. I just shed tears. Mr. Paper Bag was gone. I looked through Will's phone and found out that he had been in love with another girl for a long time. Maybe that's why Will wanted to break up with me, but I cried and begged him not to leave for every time. Recently, they planned to kill me to defraud insurance. I looked up the history of that house in Connecticut, and Google told me that in 1945, a man was disfigured because of the fire caused by his wife and her lover, and he spent the rest of his life alone in that house. One horror ends, but what lies ahead is far more sinister. I found something growing in my cornfield that I don't remember planting. I've been a corn farmer for most of my life. I don't even remember what it's like to do anything else. The thing about corn is that it grows in a straight line, dependable as the sunrise, no matter what chaos is happening around it. That's how it's always been. Corn doesn't ask questions. Last week, something broke the rules. I was out walking the fields, like I do every evening, counting my rows like a deranged farmer with too much time on his hands. That's when I saw it, a stalk that didn't look like it belonged. It was tall, taller than any corn I've ever grown, and its color was wrong. At first, I thought it was some kind of weed. I squinted at it like it owed me money, but it didn't look like any weed I'd ever seen. The stalks were twisted, darkened with an ashen, burned tinge. I crouched down, got real close, and ran my hand along the stalk. I felt wrong. It felt wrong, not like a plant at all. Warm, even, like it had blood pumping through it. I jerked my hand back and just stood there, staring at it. That's when I noticed. The blackness wasn't just confined to this stalk. The corn around it was wilting, like it was being drained of something. The life was leaking out of it, and the black thing was spreading, slow but deliberate. You'd think I would have done something. Most people would have tried, right? But the more I looked at it, the more I couldn't. I couldn't move. It was like my body and the cornfield had an understanding. You leave it alone, it leaves you alone. But that's not true, is it? I should have burned it right then and there. But I didn't. I told myself it was some weird plant I didn't recognize, maybe something the wind carried in from another field. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I went back out to the field, expecting the thing to be gone. But it wasn't. In fact, it was bigger. The black stalks had spread, weaving themselves into the surrounding corn like veins. The corn nearby was rotting, turning black, shriveling up like it was being sucked dry. I didn't tell anyone, not my wife, not the farmhands, not even the guy who comes by once a week to sell me overpriced fertilizer. Because, well, part of me already knew. I knew that nothing anyone did would matter anymore. 2 nights ago, I woke up from a sound. It wasn't anything loud. No crash, no bang, no screams. It was more of a hum, a vibration, like an old freezer rattling away in the basement. But there was no freezer, and it wasn't coming from the house. I stepped outside, barefoot on the cold ground, and the sound was everywhere, coming from the earth, the sky, from underneath. I went to the field, though I don't remember making the decision to walk. The black patch had spread again, but this time something was different. There were gaps now, places where the corn had been, where it had just vanished, leaving nothing but holes in the ground. And in those holes, nothing. Just empty space. Dark, yawning space where corn should have been. They weren't craters or pits or anything I could explain. They were just gaps. And then the humming, it got louder. Like something was tuning in. I stepped closer to one of those gaps and I could feel it. A pull, like gravity had decided to focus only on me. I crouched down and looked into the space where the corn had been, and I swear to you, I saw my house. My house, but not as it was. It was decayed, broken, like it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were cracked, the roof sagging in. The front door was wide open, swaying in the wind. I stumbled back, looked around, but there were more gaps now, all showing something different. One showed the field covered in snow, though the sky above was still warm and clear. Another showed the corn withered and dry, but the next row over looked lush and healthy. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the field shift between these impossible versions of itself, each more wrong than the last. All I know is the humming started to sync with something in me, like it was pulling a string inside my chest. I don't sleep anymore. Haven't slept since that night. The patch keeps growing. The holes keep appearing. And the more they grow, the more I can feel it, the field. It's in my head now. Not voices, not whispers, but thoughts. Old thoughts, ancient thoughts. Thoughts that don't belong to anyone but the land itself. I haven't left the field in 2 days. I can't. There's something out there. No, not something. There's just the field. It's thinking, it's remembering, and I think it's using me to remember. It's almost sundown now, and I can feel the air getting heavy again. The holes are bigger, and sometimes when I look into them, I see myself. But I'm not in the field. I'm somewhere else, somewhere darker, somewhere that doesn't belong to me. The corn is almost gone now. I know what happens next. I don't think I'll be here much longer, but the field will be. It always will be. The screams of the past faded, but the echoes of new horrors began to rise. The Cow King. When I got the call about my father's death, I decided to drive straight across the country to the funeral. I wasn't particularly close with my father, and it wasn't out of the need of closure. No, it was for the inheritance my mother told me I couldn't have unless I came. While I wasn't keen on the idea of seeing my family, I could definitely use the money. No need to overcomplicate things. Drive there, get in, get out. That was the plan. I was traveling through bumfuck nowhere, Iowa, when it happened. My Chevy began to sputter, and my engine light began to blink. I cursed, flicked on the emergency lights, and coasted onto the shoulder, my car coming to rest with a final pathetic cough. Grabbing my phone, I checked for service. Of course, there was none. I hadn't seen another car or sign of life for miles. I recalled seeing a rundown gas station a couple miles back and decided making the walk was my only option. Shit, I muttered to myself, stepping out of the car. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The wind rustled the corn, an occasional gust carrying with it a thick, earthy scent. I locked my car and started walking. I arrived just as the sun began to set, sweaty, exhausted, and thirsty. The gas station, like most things around here, seemed stuck in time. A rusty sign that read Harper's Fuel and Goods hung above the single weathered fuel pump out front. A faint buzzing noise came from the flickering open neon light in the window. I pushed the door open. The bell above jingled weakly, barely audible. The inside was dimly lit, shelves lined with old cans of beans, dusty bottles of water, and a few bags of chips. Behind the counter sat an old man, thin as a scarecrow, his skin weathered. He had a calm, distant look in his eyes, as though he'd been waiting for someone for a long time. "Car trouble, I take it?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Yeah, broke down couples miles up the road. No service either." I tried to sound casual, but something about the place made me uneasy. In my mind, I was thinking this place looked just like the kind of gas station in horror movies, just before the main character is being chased by a group of inbred killers. He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving mine. "Ain't much for signal out here. Nearest town's quite a ways off." "Yeah, I figured," I said. glancing around the store. Any chance you know of any motels or someone who could tow me? His lips pulled into a slow, thin smile. Well, I ain't no tow man, but I reckon I can help. I live just up the road. Got some tools back at the farm. You can stay the night. We'll see about fixing your car in the morning. I hesitated. The offer set off alarms in my head. But what choice did I have? My legs already ached and my stomach was empty. Making the walk back to my car didn't seem like an option. All right, I said finally. Thanks. I appreciate it. Frank's truck was old and rusted, the engine loud as we rattled down a dirt road. The fields stretched out on either side, the setting sun casting long shadows over the corn stalks. The farm came into view, a white, weathered house surrounded by a couple of barns and a silo. It looked like the kind of place time had forgotten, untouched by anything modern. The paint was peeling and the porch sagged, but hey, it was a home. Far better than the empty road behind me. As we pulled up, the porch light flickered on, and I saw them. An older woman, 2 young adults, and 2 younger children standing on the steps. They stood perfectly still, watching the truck approach. We stepped out of the truck. That there's my wife, Sue, Frank said, and our kids, John and Mary, and their little ones, Billy and Ruth. I was confused for a moment at the way he introduced them. John and Mary's little ones, do you mean? No, I must have been mistaken. An awkward moment of silence passed as I was stuck in my thoughts. Nice to meet you all. Thanks for having me, I forced out. Kid here has some car troubles. Told him he could stay the night was us, Frank told Sue. There was something strange about their faces, a certain dullness to their expressions. Still, I forced a polite smile. Sue smiled warmly as I approached, wiping her hands on a faded apron. You must be hungry. Supper's almost ready. You're welcome to join us. Thank you, I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, and her skin felt rough, calloused in a way that spoke of years of hard labor. The 2 other, younger adults, John and Mary, stood by the door, watching me without a word. Their eyes were unblinking, and their lips thin. Something about them gave me the creeps. They were like mirror images of one another. Twins, maybe? The children, Billy and Ruth, were even more unsettling. Their features were distorted, with wide, gap-toothed smiles, crooked eyes, and heads that seemed too large for their small bodies. They clung to their mother's dress, their eyes wide and unblinking. Frank ushered me inside before I had time to dwell on it. The house was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded wallpaper and old wooden furniture. The smell of cooked meat filled the air, mingling with the smell of mold. It was a heavy smell, and it made my stomach churn. The dining room was small, with a long wooden table in the center. Plates were already set, and Sue wasted no time in serving up slabs of meat and mashed potatoes. The food looked hearty enough, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The meat was dark and almost black in places, and the potatoes were watery, pooling at the bottom of the plate. Eat up, Sue said, settling down across from me. Frank sat at the head of the table, and the children lined either side. Their eyes never left me, watching with that same blank expression as I picked up my fork. So where you headed? Frank asked, breaking the silence. Funeral, I said. Out in Ohio, just passing through. Sue clucked her tongue sympathetically. That's a long way. You'll need your strength for a trip like that. I nodded, taking a tentative bite. The meat was tough, its texture stringy and oily, and the taste was metallic. I forced it down, feeling bile rise in my throat. You don't talk much, do ya? Frank asked, his grin widening. Oh, sorry, just tired, I muttered, glancing around the table. The kids were still watching me, their eyes unnervingly wide, their heads bobbing slightly with every bite they took. The longer I sat there, the more I felt the walls closing in around me. The house was stifling, the air thick and oppressive. The food sat like a stone in my stomach. Well, you'll sleep good tonight. Ain't nothing out here but peace and quiet, Frank said, his smile never fading. The bedroom they offered me was small, sparse, just a single bed with an old, sagging mattress, a nightstand, and a dresser. The window overlooked the cornfields, stretching out endlessly into the night. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the wallpaper was peeling in places. As I sat on the bed, it creaked under my weight. I tried to relax, but something about the house felt wrong. The way the family had stared at me all through dinner, the strange, almost robotic way they moved. It was all too much. The bed was uncomfortable, but exhaustion started to creep in. I lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling in the night. "I'll be out of here tomorrow," I reminded myself. That's when I heard the door creak open down the hall. I froze, listening as footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved down the hallway. I got up quietly, listening when I heard the front door open. I made my way to the window, peering through the thin curtains. Frank and his family were heading out into the yard, moving in single file toward the barn. The two younger children, Billy and Ruth, followed behind, their misshapen heads bobbing as they walked. There was something disturbingly ritualistic about their movement, a strange, silent procession under the moonlight. They reached the barn, and one by one, they disappeared inside. My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct told me not to follow, but something stronger, some morbid curiosity, pushed me to find out what they were doing in there. I slipped out of the room, moving quietly down the stairs and out the front door. The night air was cold, biting at my skin as I made my way toward the barn. The wind rustled the cornfields, and the smell of earth grew stronger with every step, and the smell of something else, decay, got stronger with every step closer to the barn. When I reached the barn, the doors were slightly ajar, just enough for me to peer inside. What I saw stopped my heart. The family stood in a circle around a crude wooden altar. Each of them wore the head of a cow. Real cow heads, not masks. The flesh was rotting, and the eyes were hollowed out, leaving only dark, gaping holes for them to peer out of. The heads were stitched to ragged cowhide robes that hung off their bodies. The smell inside the barn was unbearable, the smell of rotting meat and death. But it wasn't the family that made my blood run cold. It was what stood in the center of the altar. The thing was massive, its body a grotesque fusion of man and cow. Its legs were bent and twisted, ending in hooves, but its torso was humanoid, muscular, and covered in patches of matted fur. Its arms were long, too long, with fingers that ended in sharp, blackened nails. But its head was the most horrifying part. It was part human, part cow, its face distorted and deformed. One side was mostly human, with a bulging eye and a misshapen mouth that hung open, revealing rows of jagged yellowed teeth. The other side was more cow than man, with a long, snout-like nose and a single milky eye that seemed to ooze with pus. From the top of its skull protruded massive curved horns, slick with some kind of dark liquid that dripped onto the altar below. On top of its head was a large, crude crown made of sticks and vine. It let out a low, guttural sound, a mixture of a moo and a scream that vibrated through the air. Frank fell to his knees before it, holding up a bowl filled with something thick and red. He muttered something under his breath, a chant I couldn't understand. The creature leaned forward, dipping its monstrous head toward the bowl, lapping at the thick red liquid with a long, black tongue. "Our king, tonight we bring you an offering," John and Mary said in unison. My stomach lurched and bile rose in my throat. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. The creature's milky eye rolled in its socket, and for a moment it seemed to lock on to me. Its lips curled into something that resembled a smile, revealing more of those sharp, rotten teeth. I turned and bolted. I ran blindly through the dark, my feet pounding against the dirt path as I sprinted back toward the house. I heard the sound of the barn door swinging open and the family yelling after me. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I reached the house, I didn't bother with the door. I made a beeline for the truck parked in the yard, yanking open the door and praying the keys were still inside. They were. I fumbled with the ignition, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life just as I heard the sound of footsteps gaining on me. I didn't look back. I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the road, the tires kicking up dust as I sped away from that cursed place. I drove until the first signs of civilization appeared on the horizon, until I found a diner where I could stop and breathe. I never went to my father's funeral. Something about seeing something so horrifying and twisted made the inheritance feel irrelevant. Every night I dream of that thing appearing in my room and dragging me back to that barn. I'll never drive through Iowa again. From the shadows of one fear, a new terror begins to stir. The American sleep experiment is over. Final. For previous parts, watch our previous video Day Unknown. 3 is beginning to flood the subject room. I don't know how we've gotten to this point, but the only thing holding the water in there is the closed door. 1 has been in and out, but he always climbs through the window for some reason, leaving chunks of skin and scraping bone across the broken glass every time. The water is nearly ankle deep at this point, even filling the side rooms. I don't know where it keeps coming from, with an endless ocean being coughed from his lungs from seemingly nowhere. Eventually it's going to come up and cover 2, probably drowning him where he lay on the floor. I don't plan on being here for that, and it's not like he deserves to be saved anyway. The little girls dancing around him have become more vivid, with obvious signs of other terrible acts committed on them besides the dismemberment. 4 was still locked in his room meanwhile, with symptoms of rabies now in their final stages, catatonic and shaking, scared of everything as the water seeped in under his door. He was desperate for a drink, I could tell, but even just looking at the water was making his throat spasm violently as his mind told him it was poison. We've begun our escape attempt, though it take a while, as the surgical saw we have isn't the most powerful. It's really only meant for bone at the most, so going up against the steel used on the vents is one hell of a task for it. Eventually though, after some time, it began to get through, and from there we were able to use a cane to pry the rest open. Murray went in first, clutching a flashlight and trying to find the right path out. Taryn and I stood anxiously as he explored, hoping against all hope that he would have some success. That was about the point where I went into a dream state, against all my best efforts to stave it off. Deprivation took hold yet again, leaving me on the precipice of sleep and waking, but unable to actually get to the destination I wanted. That was when she started talking. Mikey? It was the first time she had actually acknowledged me, instead of just staring blankly into space as she did for so many nights, dissociating from life just like I was doing now. I shut my eyes, preparing to go through some sort of torture for my sins. After all, I was no different from the people we did this to. I was willing to put humans through hell just to save myself from it, no matter how much I tried to say it was some greater good bullshit I was doing. I was a part of the problem. This hell was of my own making. I strained, keeping my eyes closed against all odds, trying not to face what had happened. Any moment I expected to feel something smothering me, waiting for my slow, agonizing death that would never end. I deserved this. It was all my fault. I killed her. It wasn't out of mercy, was it? It was a way out of taking care of her, a way out of seeing the rapid decline that I would have to face, counting my days until it took hold. It was to save me. I've got you, Mikey. I heard her say, right from in front of me as a hand touched my face, slowly, ever so slowly, knowing that the feeling of peace imparted through those words could be snatched away in moments. I opened my eyes. Even when you don't, I've got you. She was smiling at me, warm and kind, the strong lines on her face forged through the years of abuse, yet still they remained kind. We embraced, tears flowing freely down my face while I sobbed for forgiveness, telling her how sorry I was, how I never wanted to hurt her, billions of confessions and pleas for my mother's mercy. I've got you, she said again, giving me a little push now. Go. I felt Taryn grab me by the arm, pulling me close back to the vent. Murray was shouting through, yelling at us to come through. The noise must have caught one's attention as he came marching in from around the corner, water sloshing around his feet. He had finally opened the sealed door, letting 3's floodwaters loose through the facility. It was rushing faster, like his brief sputters had now become a water hose. Those I couldn't see him. I could hear the drowning screams as he kept gushing water from his windpipe. As the specters around began crowding in, one was marching into view, leading them like some parade from the 9th circle of hell. He kept moving, smiling at us as he went, torso wobbling as his eviscerated body couldn't hold his spine steady. It was eerie, like a jack-in-a-box marching on skinny, fragile legs that could snap at any moment under the weight. Looking closer, I could see one leg was already broken, foot missing and bloody stump dragging closer, leaving red water in his flooding wake. The doors are open. You've been away too long. He was giggling, pointing at me as he laughed. I was still pulling myself toward the vents, desperately clambering inside. "The jailer's given up. You're officially free. Free to be you, free to be me, free to have fun with all your new friends. They've been so excited to meet you. Their playthings are getting a little boring, though they've had plenty of fun reacquainting themselves." Taryn was still pulling on me, Murray's voice breaking through the cacophony of abominations heading toward us. I finally got all the way into the vent, crawling as Mom smiled behind me, watching me leave as she was lost to the crowd of undead. They began coming after us, even in the vents. I made the mistake of looking back, seeing the dismembered, charred arms of Five's victims crawling after us. I sped up, desperately trying to outrun the death that was following after me. I knew they couldn't kill me, knew I would only face a millennia of terror if they took hold of me. I had gone too long past the point of no return. Once they got hands on me, I was theirs, forever. We got to the end, finally seeing a bit of light peeking through ahead of us. Murray was already standing there, having broken off the outer vent to get out. The sun was up, daylight pouring in from our destination, golden rays that promised at least some sort of freedom. Electricity ran through my spine, though whether it was the gas or my own adrenaline, I don't know. Practically falling out of the vent, Taryn and I hit solid ground and felt grass in our hands. It was beautiful, one of the best things I've ever felt. Even with bright sunlight streaming over me, causing my head to pulse with tremendous pain. The phantoms were still thumping behind us, though, threatening to drag us back into hell. There wasn't much other choice than to run, all of us staggering as we desperately crashed through trees and brush to try and find some safety. Eventually, we came out to a roadside before we were swarmed. This time not by phantoms, but by black vans, men jumping out and pulling guns on us as they threw thick cloth bags over our heads, then tossing us into the cars. I don't know how long we drove for, not like my sense of time is anything to judge by anyway. When they eventually took us out, they still didn't take the bags off. The only way I could tell we entered a building was the change in sound and a blast of cold air conditioning hitting me, chilling my bones. Eventually I was thrown into a room, Taryn alongside me. Murray was missing, nowhere to be found. As for the room, it was like having the script flipped on us. There was a one-way observation mirror on the side, with no way for us to see what was going on. A small bathroom with shower and toilet in the corner, 2 cots on the opposite wall, a desk sat in the middle of the room with 3 chairs, and that was it. The 2 of us had no idea what the hell we were supposed to do now. The door opened. Needless to say, we were not happy about who entered. Murray walked in the room, smiling at the 2 of us. "Sorry for the rough welcome, but there's still the possibility you could leak where we are if you recognized anything. I don't mind you talking about this, but I can't have you spilling the location," he said, taking a seat on one side of the table and gesturing us to the other side. Both Taryn and I sat down hesitantly, glaring at our friend as we began to put information together in our disoriented minds. "See, nobody is going to believe what you have to say anyway. Who would, after all? Sounds like one of those bullshit internet stories the kids are obsessed with these days." "Why are we here, Murray?" I asked, looking around furtively to see if there were any phantoms following us. "What's going on?" "Oh, don't worry. You 2 are safe," he said, smiling. "See, I took a liking to the 2 of you while we were all in that house. I told them we could use you still, so they let me get you out. You've been going through the same thing we have, man." "What the fuck?" Taryn was asking him now, beginning to bang on the table in frustration. Her eyes were red, bloodshot from tears and lack of sleep for, God, how long has it been? Taryn broke down now. "Why? Oh, I've been getting a solid 8 hours most nights. You 2 would never find me, but I was just fine," he said. My head hurt as dots connected, Murray's lack of specters, his long disappearances. Jesus. He was the one who left a fire extinguisher in the subject room. He knew. "You have an antidote, don't you?" I asked him, leveling a look right in his eyes that said to tell me the truth, or else. "Of course. I wasn't going in there without one." He laughed. "I was just there to observe how things went down. A control." "You son of a bitch. Son of a bitch." Taryn began to scream, beginning to stand up and jump over the table at him. 2 guards entered the room, guns drawn and pointing at her. Despite our unfortunate immortality, she backed off, working on that basic survival instinct to stay alive. Look, I'm not going to stay here and spill everything. I helped you guys get out of there. Now, we're going to detox you from the gas and see how it goes. As far as what happened, subjects aren't privy to experimental data, Murray stated, getting up to leave and ushering the others out. There's a computer over there if you want to catch up on the outside. Hell, tell people what happened to you. Not like they're going to take it seriously. He left, with me in stunned silence and Taryn raging, banging against the table in frustration. Now here I am, unsure of what to do. I thought I wouldn't make it out of there, much less be allowed to somehow tell the story. Too bad nobody is going to believe me. Day 54. Yeah, I'm shocked by the day too. We were in there nearly 2 months. Considering that the major violence started around day 10, I don't know how we got out. Neither me nor Taryn have slept yet, and we've been here for 12 hours so far by the clock on the wall. They've brought us food, but I'm not hungry. Now that I think about it, I stopped eating weeks ago. I'm paranoid. They're going to do the same thing as we did, dosing the food to keep us up in the absence of the gas. Now that we're somewhere without screams and the smell of death, it feels like we can think more clearly. We've talked about it, everything that happened. The best hypothesis is that sleep maintains the barrier between life and death, earth and hell, so to speak. Whether that goes at the same pace for everyone is where I feel that we've seen variances, and Taryn suggests that it may be based on life experiences. When the barrier begins to thin, all these lost lives press through the barrier, eventually ripping it and giving them access to the subject physically. We have no idea if we're right, of course, but it's all that we can draw from our time, especially considering we're still running off of the after effects of the gas. Murray hasn't spoken to us again, and I honestly don't know that he will. I don't believe we'll ever be let out of here to see the sun again, if I'm being honest. This room feels empty compared to the crowds of bodies and limbs that were around the facility for the past month and a half. If it weren't for Taryn, I would probably feel like the last man on Earth, locked away and forgotten as everyone else got to eternally dream and slumber. Day 56. The dream states are getting worse, with even more sporadic occurrences and longer cycles. I've still not seen any phantoms, and the jailer hasn't made a reappearance. Not for me, at least. Taryn says that she's caught glimpses from the corner of her eye again. It had disappeared for her not long after it did for me, giving up hope on every getting us back. She said it returned last night, though, first a small shadow in the corner, pushed as far back and away from her as could be. Since then, though, she says it has started to grow closer, though still miles away in the same room. I'm slipping out again. If anything happens, I'll update, but what's the point anymore? Day 62. She's asleep. Taryn fell asleep 2 hours ago. I thought she had finally died somehow at first, checking her pulse in fear to see if she was still with me. It was beating strong and her breathing was now steady and deep. When I pulled one of her eyelids open, she was well into the deep REM cycle, finally resting after weeks of conscious hell. The last few days she's mentioned the jailer growing closer, coming further into view. Both of us have been comparing symptoms as we've been here, noticing that the electric feeling in her spine was fading as the figure grew closer. It wasn't so unbearable anymore, sending electric shocks up and down our bodies still, but more like a light buzz instead of a taser now. A few hours ago, she mentioned that the jailer was closer than she had seen it before. She reached her hand out, touching it, and not long after, laid down to sleep. Nothing has appeared for me. Not the jailer, not the phantoms, nothing. The electricity is still there, and I'm hoping to some kind of god that it wears off so I may be able to sleep soon. Day 70. Taryn has been sleeping regularly for the past week now. The first time when I made my last update, she slept for nearly 20 hours straight. When she awoke, according to her, everything was bright, almost an electric vividness to the world. Since falling asleep, she hasn't seen anything. I still haven't seen the jailer return, and that's what leads me to my final, terrifying conclusion. They let Taryn out, though I don't know where. Maybe she's actually allowed to go back to her normal life. Could we do that at this point, though? It doesn't matter. I don't have long. I know what it was now, the jailer. We've always had a name for it, tons of them actually. Morpheus, Nyx, Hypnos, Somnus, Tsukiyumi. Every culture has their own version, but what it is really is sleep. Sleep itself. It only wanted to save us from the hell we made. It hasn't reappeared to me. I can't feel the electricity buzzing in my spine anymore. I've requested tests from the guard that brings in my food, and they've complied, taking me in for a brain scan. Please pray that something will work for me, dream for me, sleep for me. Please, sleep. Day 85, I can see them again. Not sleep, the subjects. They're all just there. They glare at me from the shadows and corners, watching me and waiting for their chance to strike. I don't know how they got here. I don't know what they want from me. Probably to tear me apart like their victims did to them. None appear as they did in life, but as they were left in the facility. Burnt, drowned, ripped to shreds. Everyone is here. All because of me. I don't know at this point whether it's the hallucinations or if their souls have actually come for me. As of yet, they don't seem to want to come after me. I'm sure, given time, that will change. Die 90, I fear I'm done. They're inching closer, eyes fixated on me, at least the ones that have eyes. I can hear curses and screams coming from them, and one's obnoxious mocking laughter won't get out of my ears. It came back too, though. It's still faint, but it's there. I can tell. The jailer? No, that doesn't seem like the right thing to call it. It's getting closer, the cosmos making up its body pulsating as it does. I swear in just hours it's come so close, closer than they have. Day? She's back. Mom is here and the others have gone away. They seemed angry when she showed up, like they were told their fun was called off. She's smiling at me though, that same smile that said it's all going to be okay. Mom just walked over to the jailer, still watching me from so close but so goddamn far to still reach. She's taken the hand of the cosmos, smiling at me and extending her other hand towards me, reaching for mine. I don't know what may happen. I don't know if I'm just lost in my own delusion, but I think this will be it for me. I'm going to take her hand now. Goodbye. We barely escaped the first nightmare, but the next one is already closing in. I ran into something scarier than any animal while hunting alone. This happened back in the fall of 2016. I live in a very small and rural community where everyone knows everyone. The state that I live in allows rifle, mule, deer, buck hunting during the first week of October. Sustenance hunting is very important in the culture of my area. This fall, I was lucky enough to have drawn a buck tag. I had made plans to hunt on my grandmother's farm on this evening. Given that I am a smaller woman, I had asked my husband to go with me in case I killed something. He could help me pack it out. However, he could not go due to work obligations. Fine, no problem. I have hunted this farm many times by myself. I know it like the back of my hand. I strapped on my boots, grabbed my rifle and binoculars, tucked my cell phone into my pocket and made my way to my Jeep. My grandmother's farm consists of corn, bordering an alfalfa field along a river. Between the river and the farm are lines of old-growth trees. This is the perfect place to fill at a buck tag. I parked my Jeep about a mile upriver from the fields, then began walking along the tree line towards the area where the deer had mostly been feeding. At the opposite end of the field, there is a large haystack where all the harvested alfalfa is stored. As I saw it coming into my field of view, I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I kneeled down and viewed the area through my binoculars. I could see a very tall, large man walking briskly towards me from behind the haystack. I knew for a fact that I was supposed to be the only one hunting this farm on this night, as I had just spoken to my grandmother. Something inside me told me I needed to get out of the area as fast as I could. I initially tried to turn around and walk back down the trees to my Jeep. But given that I have such short legs, this guy was quickly closing the gap quickly. He was still several hundred yards from me, so I decided to try to cross the river instead. I found that the river was too muddy and deep for me to safely cross. I thought my only option was to attempt to get signal on my cell phone. When he walked across a small ditch and disparaged from my line of sight, I quickly darted into the corn and kept quiet. I could hear him walking closer and closer. I desperately tried to call my husband. Back then, the closest cell towers were over 30 miles away, and cell service was extremely spotty. I could not connect to my husband or 911. By this point, the man was within 100 yards of me. I could hear him ripping corn out, stomping around, and loudly cussing, "Where the fuck did you go?" Another issue is it was getting dark quickly. I definitely did not want to be in the dark alone with this man. I watched him for a few minutes and was able to determine that he did not have a gun. After weighing my options, I decided to step out and see if I could de-escalate the situation, as I work in healthcare and work with mentally unstable people all the time. I stepped out of the corn. "Hi, I'm sorry if I interrupted you, Hunt, or something. I did not mean to cause any harm," I said with a sweet smile on my face. I made sure there was at least 80 yards of distance between us. His eyes locked with mine, and it was obvious there was something with this man. He stood about 6'5" tall. His clothes were absolutely filthy, stained with what appeared to be his own waste and sweat. His shirt was torn and had dried blood on it. His face was crooked, as if he had had a stroke prior, and he slurred his words. "There you fucking are," he yelled. He reached down and grabbed a massive stick. I'm talking a stick at least 5 feet long. He could have easily killed me with this stick. I stood my ground and grabbed my rifle from my back and pointed it at him. He stopped holding the stick. We looked at each other for a second when he began yelling. "Do you know whose farm you're on?" I stated. "Yes, this is my grandmother's farm. I've hunted it my whole life." The veins began to pop out of his head. "No, this is not. My wife is hunting in this cornfield and you ruined it. Because of you, she missed a huge buck, you stupid bitch." He became so enraged he started making strange growling sounds and started spitting everywhere. I was running through the options in my head at this point when he suddenly started to lunge at me. I turned the safety off my rifle and loudly stated, "Stop, I will shoot if I have to." He froze in his tracks and just stared at me for about 30 seconds before dropping the stick. He grunted loudly with his eyes darting around. "Listen, I don't want to have to do something we will both regret. I am very sorry I ruined your hunt. If you turn around and walk away from me, I will leave." I calmly explained. I could see his thinking hard about what to do next when he mumbled, "Fine," and turned around, stomping back towards the haystack. My heart was about to beat out of my chest. I was not about to turn my back on this man, though. I watched until he walked distance away, and then I darted back into the corn. I thought back on how he said I spooked a massive buck and ruined his wife's hunt, but that did not make any sense. I had a good view of the whole field, and there were no deer present. I decided to observe him through my binoculars. I watched him climb up to the haystack and get into a small 2-door white car. He quickly peeled out of the haystack lot. I was able to catch that the car had California license plates, but nothing more. I live nowhere near California. He took off down the road, and he was alone. No one else was in that vehicle. I ran back to my Jeep and locked myself in it. I sped home as fast as I could and told my husband what happened. I had never seen this man in my life, and neither had my husband based off my description. We live in a community of about 200 people. Born and raised here, we know everyone. I called our local sheriff, and they came out and took a statement. I took them to the haystack where he was parked, and we found a knife lying on the ground. Of course, nothing could be done, as I was not able to get a plate number or a name from the man. To this day, I still have no idea what the man's intentions were, even though I could guess on a few. It's been 8 years, and I have never seen this man again. I also decided that I'd be hunting with a buddy from then on. The darkness receded, only to unveil something even more twisted. What we know is all wrong. I have been contemplating about writing this for a long time. Truth is, I don't know if this is real or if it's all in my head. Whatever this is, though, has changed me in so many ways, and I now know I am in danger. We all are. But let's start from the beginning. The first time it happened, I was praying. I had recently lost my grandmother, and I was feeling lost. I decided that I would turn to God to find peace and some answers, and come to terms with her death. The chapel I went to was the one that my grandmother used to take me. It was small and always very quiet. Not many people visited. I decided to go there to feel closer to her. As I walked in, I could see no one in, which made me feel better. I really didn't want to lose it in front of other people. I sat down to enjoy the silence and started praying. Imagine my surprise when in the middle of my prayer, I heard this little voice whispering, "I hear you." I jumped up and looked around. I was clearly alone and I could not locate the source of the voice. I decided that it was a figment of my imagination and continued to pray. 5 minutes later, though, the voice came stronger. "You shouldn't be doing that." It was right next to my ear, so close it made the hairs on my neck stand up and sent shivers down my spine. As I turned around, I came face to face with a girl. She couldn't have been older than me, maybe 11 to 12. She was wearing this red dress, and she was barefoot. Her hair was the darkest black I have ever seen, and her eyes the same. I started screaming, but at the same time, I was mesmerized by her beauty. "Shh," she said, putting her hand on my mouth. "Do you want Father to hear us?" Her touch was soothing and not threatening in any way. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to fight back tears. "I am the devil," she said. The first unwanted. I started trembling, fearing this was the end of me. She moved closer, and as if reading my mind, she said, "Don't worry, my child. I won't hurt you. I am not the one you should be afraid of. I have come to warn you, as I have done with so many others." A sudden noise, like whistling, made her stop talking, and I could see fear in her eyes. I tried to locate the source of the sound, and by the time I turned around to face her, she was gone. Only her scent lingered. This lovely lavender scent. I stayed there, not moving, trying to listen for what felt like hours. I was sure I was going crazy, and convinced myself this was all due to grief and lack of sleep. But as I closed the door behind me to head to my car, I heard her whisper again. "Be careful." It had been a week since the incident, and I had almost forgotten about it. I could hear the occasional whisper and catch a glimpse of something red in the corner of my eye, but never something specific. Fate would have it. I had to go and pick up my mom from the bus station, and the only way there, yes, you guessed it, was past the road with the chapel. The drive was uneventful until I got to the crossing in front of the chapel. I was getting nervous remembering what had happened, so I turned the radio on louder and tried to find a relaxing song, and that's when it came. The smell. The freaking lavender smell. I looked up from the radio, and there she was. She was standing in front of the car. She looked exactly as she had before, but different at the same time. Older, tired. I screamed and got out of the car. I started running in the field behind me. I was losing it. The tears came and I succumbed to my fate. I turned around to face her, as I could feel she had followed me. "What do you want from me?" I screamed at her. She looked at me with that deep sadness in her eyes and came closer. "I want you to hear me out, child. I want to protect you. I am running out of time and you have to help me." I was lost for words, but somehow mastered the courage to reply. "Me? Help you? Aren't you supposed to be all-powerful and, evil? Aren't you the devil?" She came next to me and this time smiled. "My lovely child, yes, I was powerful once, but evil never. As for the name, I kinda hate it. You can call me Lilith." Somewhere in the distance, whistling was heard. I tried to speak, but she cut me off. "Child, you have to understand that what you know is all wrong. The world is in danger. You have been taught so many lies. You have been deceived. I am not the one you should be afraid of. I am not the one that is going to hurt you. I was God once." Hearing that, I started laughing. I laughed and laughed because I was sure I was crazy. This could not be happening. This thing in front of me, Lilith, was claiming to be God. She grabbed my hand and my laugh was cut short. "Child, you have to understand," she said. "I don't have much time. Can't you see I am different? I am getting older, dying even. He found a way to make it happen. And if I am gone, there is no one to save you. See through the lies. Believe me." The whistling was heard again, closer. She squeezed my hand with profound urgency and pleading eyes. Whatever made me say the next words changed my life forever. "Okay, let's say I start to believe you. How can I help? What is happening?" The wind picked up suddenly and I saw her shivering. "Not here," she said. "I will explain tonight, in the chapel. Tell no one where you are going. Don't even think about it in your mind. He is everywhere." And with that, she disappeared. I was left alone once again, thinking that I was insane, imagining things. The red mark on my hand from where she held me, though, was there to prove me wrong. I suddenly remembered about my mom and checked the time. I was surprised to see that no time had passed and somehow I was standing right next to my car. I decided to do what I was told and not to dwell on it in my head. I don't know who he was, but I was suddenly afraid. The rest of the drive was uneventful, and I have to admit that seeing my mom made me feel better. Upon returning home, we sat down and had dinner together, happily chatting away and reminiscing about the last time she came to visit. Suddenly, she stood up and proceeded to say she had a gift for me. She ran out to the car and brought in this little packet and gave it to me. "I hope you like it, my dear. It's a new perfume. Try it," she said. I thanked her and proceeded to open it. I took the cap up to smell it and froze. It was lavender. I tried my best to hide my horror from my mother and casually asked her why she chose to buy me this specific one. In retrospective, I wish I never asked because her answer chilled me to the core. She explained that she was in the shop struggling to buy me a present when a girl approached her, a girl roughly my age, with a lovely red dress. Her hair was the darkest black, and so were her eyes. My mom said she was instantly drawn to the girl, and they started chatting. The girl was really interested to hear that my mother had a daughter and asked all sorts of questions about me. She said the girl suggested the perfume because it was her favorite. My mother said the girl seemed sure that I would love it, as lavender has such a soothing and familiar scent. I wish I could tell her how wrong she was. With this discovery in my mind, I decided I couldn't hear anymore, so I found an excuse to cut the conversation short and put a film on. A couple of hours later, I said goodnight to my mom and headed up to my room. The time was almost midnight. I made sure my mom went to bed, waited a bit until she fell asleep, and got ready to make my way to the chapel. I was terrified, but determined to find out what was going on. "Okay, Lilith," I whispered as I got in my car. "You have my attention." As the last tale ends, a new one claws its way to the surface. It took my sister. It started as a normal summer evening. My sister and I sat in the living room, aimlessly flipping through TV channels, trying to figure out how to spend the night. That's when I had the idea. "Hey, let's camp out in the van," I said, glancing toward the window. The old blue van sat in the driveway, its trunk perfect for a cozy little campout. "Outside?" my sister asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "Yeah, why not? It'll be fun." We crawled into the van, its old interior filled with the familiar musty smell of fabric seats and stale air. The darkness inside felt cozy at first, like we'd created our own little world, separate from everything else. The blankets we brought rustled softly as we settled in, their worn texture comforting against my skin. We had a flashlight, but we kept it off, preferring the dim glow from the house lights filtering through the windows. The night was cool, a breeze occasionally sweeping across the van, causing the air to shift, carrying with it the faint scent of grass and the dampness of the evening. I felt safe there, with my sister beside me, a faint hum of crickets in the distance providing a peaceful background. But after a while, the air in the van grew heavier, the cozy feeling replaced by something more oppressive. It was as though the shadows themselves were thickening, pressing in from all sides. And then it happened. The urge to look through the back window came out of nowhere. It was a slow, creeping feeling, like someone standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. My skin prickled, the hair on my arms standing on end. I couldn't resist it. I had to look. My stomach tightened as I turned, bracing myself for, I didn't even know what. When my eyes met those two glowing red orbs, a cold rush of terror shot through me, freezing me in place. They weren't just glowing, they burned, like embers smoldering in the dark. The red was the same color as the stoplights at the end of the street, glaring through the night, but these eyes were alive, staring straight through me. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. The world outside the van fell away, and it was just me and those eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, loud and erratic, each beat shaking my whole body. I wanted to run, to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat, paralyzed by the weight of that gaze. "Sis, come here," I whispered. She slid up beside me and followed my gaze. Her face paled as she saw what I saw. "Stay here," I whispered urgently. "Don't move. I'm going to get Mom and Dad." Before she could protest, I slipped out of the van and bolted for the house. My feet barely touched the ground as I raced across the yard, my mind racing faster than my legs. I burst through the back door, panting, and found Dad sitting at the kitchen table. "Dad, there's something outside by the van. It has red eyes, and it picked up the van. You have to come, please." He didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Stop joking around. Either come inside or stay out there, but enough with the stories," he said, his voice as flat as ever. "I'm not joking," I pleaded, feeling my pulse in my throat. "Please, Dad, you have to come." He sighed and waved me off. "Go tell your mom, then." I rushed into the living room, where Mom sat on the couch watching TV. "Mom, there's something out there, something with red eyes. It lifted the van." My voice was frantic, desperate. Mom turned to me and shook her head, smiling softly. "You've always had such a vivid imagination. It's probably just a shadow or a reflection. Go back outside and play." I stood there, speechless, as the seconds ticked by. No one was going to help. Panic set in, and without another word, I ran back outside. My chest tightened with dread as I reached the van. But when I looked inside, my sister was gone. The van was empty. My sister was gone. I stared, frozen, my mind racing, heart pounding in my ears. I called out her name, but my voice sounded hollow, lost in the still night air. There was no sign of her, no movement, no sound. Just the van, eerily still, as if nothing had happened. I felt a deep, gnawing panic rising in my chest. The red eyes. I wasn't imagining them. I knew what I'd seen, but now she was gone, and there was no trace of anything. I ran back to the house, my breath coming in short gasps. "She's gone!" I yelled as I burst into the living room. "She's gone! She's not there anymore! You have to come help!" Mom glanced at Dad, concern flashing across her face. But there was something else there too, something calmer, more resigned. "Calm down," Dad said, standing up slowly. "I'm sure she's around here somewhere. She's probably playing a game or hiding. You know how she is." "No, you don't get it. She's gone. She didn't leave on her own. I saw something. It took her." Dad's face hardened, the usual sternness returning. "Enough already. We're not playing these games." "But I'm telling the truth. There were red eyes, and it lifted the van." "You didn't see it, but I did." My voice cracked, teetering between frustration and fear. Mom walked over, putting her hands on my shoulders. "Sweetheart, you're upset. I know you're scared, but your sister didn't get taken by any monster. Sometimes when bad things happen, our minds make up stories to help us cope. You've always had a vivid imagination." Her tone was soothing, almost too calm for the situation. I shook my head, my stomach churning. But I saw." "She didn't get taken by a monster," Mom repeated, her voice firmer now. "Your sister was kidnapped. That's all. The police will come soon and will find her. Don't blame yourself for what happened. It's not your fault." Kidnapped. That word hung in the air, heavy and foreign. It felt wrong, too simple to explain what I saw. But the way they said it, like it was already decided, settled. My heart dropped into my stomach. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "No, that's not what happened. I saw something. There were red eyes." Dad sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, I know you're upset. It's hard to accept, but there's no monster. You were scared, and your mind played tricks on you." I wanted to argue, to make them believe me, but the words stuck in my throat. I was fighting a losing battle. They wouldn't listen. But I knew what I saw. In the days that followed, my sister's disappearance became the talk of the neighborhood. The police came, asking questions, searching the area, but they didn't find anything. People came and went, bringing food, offering sympathy, but none of it mattered. Every time someone asked me what happened, I could only tell them the same thing. I saw red eyes. And every time, they'd give me that same look, half pity, half disbelief. Dad wouldn't talk about it. He buried himself in work. Mom, on the other hand, hovered around me constantly, always checking in, always saying the same thing. "Don't blame yourself." But how could I not? I left her. I ran inside. I should have stayed, should have protected her. But the worst part was the gnawing doubt. What if they were right? What if there was no creature, no red eyes? What if it was all in my head, a trick my mind played on me to make sense of losing her? I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment over and over. The red eyes, the van lifting off the ground, her face as I told her to stay put. What if I was wrong? The fear was momentarily gone, but something more wicked waited in the silence. We were trapped in an abandoned suburb to Montfort. For previous parts, watch our previous video. Their reflections had no eyes, just empty, black sockets. It wasn't a split-second frame either. Every moment where the camera catches their reflections, they appeared to have no eyes. The reality began to set in. I had been suspicious, but I hadn't known it was truly that bad. If anything, I thought the real Bryce and Zach were somewhere hurt, and these were just copies. The truth was, they were eyeless wraiths, just like the 4 victims of the Eye Ripper, their spirits corrupted by the evil here. Soullessness hurts, that's what Zach had said. Zach fell victim to that boy in the basement, then Bryce fell victim to Zach when we left them alone together. They wanted to lure us outside so they could jump us and take our eyes like their eyes had been taken. It was like a zombie infection type of thing. If your eyes were ripped out in this ghastly place, you ended up a monster as well. Forced to haunt a limbo, looking for something you may never find, driven to mutilating living people despite it not doing anything but spreading the torment like a virus. I was determined not to end up like that. I wondered if any of us had looked at the mirror at any point, would we have seen the lack of eyes in the reflection, or was it only visible on camera? We were so distracted, of course, we didn't look at the vanity. I shuddered as I imagined what it would have felt like to discover such a horrifying thing with Zach and Bryce still in the room with us. But where were their bodies? If Zach was truly dead, why hadn't we found his corpse in the basement? Same with Bryce, why hadn't we found his corpse in that room? Whatever the case, after seeing this, I wasn't willing to waste another moment sulking or grieving. I was going to gather everyone and look for more eyes. I had a feeling I knew how too. I stood up from the corner with the intention of rousing Vanessa to ask her questions about the Eye Ripper case, when something caught my eye. The window. The curtains that covered it had a small sliver of space open between them, where I saw a pale nose almost flush against the glass pane. Fear struck me like a lightning bolt, and I yanked one side of the curtain open to reveal a different ghost boy. The one in the basement had black hair, this one had brown hair, and a little blood smudged under his nose. His head immediately shifted ever so slightly so his hollow eye sockets were facing me. His little hands were pressed against the window. He looked like he was in a crouching position. It suddenly hit me that we were on the 2nd floor. I am going to find your eyes. I desperately tried to reason with the thing. So please, leave me and my friends alone until then, okay? The boy stared at me with an emotionless face. Then his lower jaw unhinged, turning his mouth into an O shape, and a puff of vapor ghosted from between his white lips and fogged the glass. Slowly and mechanically, he used a finger to draw a pair of eyes in the window. They were shaped like lemons with big irises and little pupils. I nodded eagerly, thinking I was getting somewhere with this. Yes, your eyes. I'm going to give them back to you. Then, with his finger, he erased the details off the eyes he drew, including the irises and pupils, until it looked like 2 darkened ovals, mimicking empty eye sockets. I frowned. I knew the implication, but I wasn't sure if this was a threat aimed at me or if he was showing what had been done to him. I shook my head, not knowing what to say next. The boy simply crawled up and above the window, towards the roof, scaling the wall like a spider. I closed the curtains again, feeling myself tremble. That interaction didn't instill me with any hope at all. I could hear him crawling on the part of the roof above the room we were in, and it freaked me out. But I tried to ignore it as I continued my course of action. Could they get into the house? Yasmin said locked doors don't deter ghosts, but maybe she was wrong, or these were a different type of ghost. She told me about ghost categories in the past. Some of them follow the rules of the physical world, like being able to be hurt with blunt force. In any case, they clearly knew where we were. I woke Vanessa up and said, "We need to start trying to escape. I have to ask you some questions about the 4 kids." She rubbed her eyes and sat up, loosening her hood. Like what? Millie's eyes were hidden in her teddy. I began to explain as I paced the room. So I began to wonder, are the other eyes hidden like that? I dunno, she shrugged. Was her teddy noted as missing in the report? I asked. Yeah, the articles and news reports all mentioned she went missing with her stuffed bear, Vanessa replied. Did the other kids go missing with any objects? I chewed my lip in thought. Yes, actually. Vanessa perked up. Peter, the black-haired boy in the red shirt, went missing with his school backpack. Oh, and Sarah's little purse she got for her birthday was with her when she was kidnapped and wasn't found anywhere. What about the other kid, William? I began to grow hopeful. Let me think. I could see the cogs turning in Vanessa's head. Damn, I don't think I remember William going missing with any other than the clothes on his back. She sighed. We'll figure that out later. I waved her worries away. Right now, we're going to be on the lookout for that backpack and that purse. It's like you said, serial killers keep souvenirs. Those items were what the kids were last seen with, so he kept them for himself, and I guess he saw their eyes as souvenirs too, so he placed them inside those things, if my theory is right. I hope I'm right, at least. So you think they're in the basement? She looked nervous. That should be the first place to check. I nodded. After all, the last time we went, we didn't know exactly what to look out for, and that basement is like the inside of a hoarder's house. Do you remember seeing anything like that down there? She shook her head no. What's the color of the backpack and purse? Vanessa fought hard to remember. The backpack was a dark color, something from back in the day, and I don't remember the exact color. The purse was pink. It matched her shirt. I remember that much at least. Great. We just got to get Yaz and John and go back there. Then we'll only need one more set of eyes. I marched towards the door, Vanessa hot on my heels. First, I went to John's room and opened the door. He was lying on his side on a twin bed, facing the wall. It looked like it had once been a little boy's room, but the boy in the old photograph on the floor wasn't any of the victims. Vanessa saw me looking at the picture. The neighbors moved out not long after the murders, she elaborated. They were very hush-hush about it and wouldn't answer any reporters' questions. I think they started to realize that this place was becoming like it is now. John, I called to him. Walking over, we know how to find at least 4 other eyes. We just need to go back to that basement. I know it's scary as all hell, but we made it out just fine last time, and this is the only way to escape with our lives. He didn't answer me or move a muscle, and I sighed, wondering how I was going to get him to comply. Vanessa pointed, "Shut that window. Why is it even open?" I looked over to see that, indeed, the window halfway obscured with dark blue drapes was wide open. Damn it. I went over and shut it, fairly fed up. "John, be a man and get your ass up." I started to feel uneasy as he refused to move. I exchanged a nervous glance with Vanessa. His stillness was reminding me too much of the ghost children, and I could feel the air thicken with tension. What if one of those entities had entered through the window? I slowly crept over to his bed, steadily reaching my hand out then. I yanked his arm towards me, pulling his body onto his back. I expected to see him emotionlessly staring at me like Zach and Bryce had, but instead I saw red-rimmed eyes, a snotty nose, and cheeks glistening with tears. He wasn't a ghost. He was simply crying and ashamed. "Leave me alone." He pulled away from me. "Don't you want to get out of here?" Vanessa asked with frustration. "Stop wallowing and get up." I thought she was being a hypocrite, but I didn't say anything. "Fine." John pushed himself up and wiped his tears away. "But I'm not going back to that basement." "Then where are you going?" I asked as he stood up. "You know those other 2 roads?" he asked me. "The ones that don't lead back to town. I'm going to try one of them. Even if they don't go back home, maybe they go somewhere far from here." I groaned. "You can't be serious. You think only that one road was affected by the curse here? You'll just end up right back here. You 2 can go hunting for rotten eyes as much as you want." He snapped. "But I can't stay here. I can't, man." He rushed past us. "Wait," I called after him. "Zach and Bryce, remember. I'll go through the back door," he called back. "Whatever," my face felt hot from anger. "Let's go get Yaz. She won't abandon us." Vanessa and I went to the room where Yaz had run to. She was standing at the window, peeking out through a crack in the blinds at the front yard and street outside. The moonlight made her brown eyes sparkle along with her tears, and she seemed both pissed and depressed as she scanned the area for any signs of those wraiths. She didn't look up when we gently opened the door. "Yaz," I said softly so as not to startle her, creeping forward. "We gotta go. I have a plan." "I saw an adult," Yasmin replied emotionlessly, and I could hear her swallow from across the room, as if she was forcing bile back down her throat. "What?" Vanessa and I said at the same time and looked at each other. She was back to holding the camera and recording, but her eyes were looking over the screen and at my best friend with hope glimmering in them. An adult, Yasmin repeated, her gaze not leaving the window. It was a woman, and she was standing beside that house over there. She pointed. Just by the woods, so still I almost didn't notice her. So someone else is trapped here? I tried to wrap my mind around this, stuck between thinking it was unfortunate for another person to be stuck in this dreadful place, but also being happy that we weren't alone. Truth be told, I was exhausted at playing the role of leader and wanted nothing more than a grown-up to make all the hard decisions for me. Yeah, you can say that. She still didn't look at us, but she's not alive, like us. She had no eyes. My heart plummeted to the bottom of my stomach, and the look on Vanessa's face told me hers did the same. So, Vanessa began, the kids aren't the only ghosts here. No, Yasmin shook her head, sounding numb. I thought of something and patted my pockets. I pulled out the phone I had found earlier, which was now fully charged from my power bank, and turned it on. I was met with the faces of two smiling women as the home screen. The most recently opened app at the bottom was the camera. I clicked on it and found a video, the date being a year ago. I heard Vanessa approaching my side to see what I was doing as I played the video. Frantic breaths and whimpering sobs immediately blasted from the speakers. If anyone sees this, one of the women from the home screen had her sweaty, terrified face extremely close to the camera. Tell my mom that I love her. Tell my fiancé that I'm so sorry that I couldn't come back to him. My name is Lisa Waller and I'm a journalist. I heard rumors about this place and... The distant sound of a twig snapping made the woman's head snap away from the camera. We could see that she was in the woods, somewhere around this terrible street. The camera shook as she stood up and started running. They won't let me leave, she desperately screamed as she ran for her life. If you're here and you're listening to this, you need to find what's left of him here. That boy Will, he was the last and he got free. He ran into the trees, but the killer caught him. His parents are part of the occult. He started this. I just know he did. Please, I don't want to be like them. Jesus, I whispered, Vanessa in silent shock as she looked over my shoulder. Yasmin still hadn't moved from her spot, but she stared at us, unnerved. It's her. It's Rachel, the woman cried. She doesn't have any fucking eyes, and she's been chasing me for hours. There was another minute of panting and thundering footsteps before. No, stop, Rach. Suddenly, the camera was now focused on the ground as the woman dropped her phone and screamed gutturally, followed by a wet, squelching sound and a resounding thud that shook the camera a bit. She was silent. Then feet walked into the frame, wearing sandals. The phone was picked back up, and we gasped as the camera focused on the eyeless corpse of Lisa Waller, sprawled over the forest floor. Your sacrifice won't be forgotten, a woman's voice hollowly said from behind the camera. I screamed as the camera flipped to the face of the other woman from the home screen picture, deathly pale with two gaping voids instead of eyes. She raised two bloodied, torn-out blue eyes to the camera. Please come here, she pleaded to us in a quiet voice, almost as if she could see us. If the body rejects the soul, we have to hunt again. We need you. Don't be afraid. We watched in horror as the specter brought the camera into the basement of the Eye Ripper house, her breath and sound of her footsteps eerily absent from the video as she traveled quicker than what appeared normal. The closer she got to the basement, the more the video glitched out, freezing and cutting forward by a few seconds. We could barely tell what was happening. It was dark, and clearly the file was corrupted. Then finally, her grotesque face again, barely visible in the darkness. Why didn't it work? She asked so quietly we almost couldn't hear her. I can feel myself becoming nothing. What am I? Then it ended. With jittery fingers, I dropped the phone, feeling as if it was still connected to that horrifying spirit and wanting to be rid of it entirely. It wouldn't help us anyway. There was, of course, no way of contacting the outside world, and I wasn't concerned about evidence at the moment. That phone and the pack of half-smoked cigarettes, I swallowed. Everyone who's come here ended up like this. That's why those were there. They're things left behind by people who died here. Who knows how many things in that basement weren't even there before it became abandoned. How much of that actually belonged there? I just couldn't seem to process it. It all felt like a bad dream. I knew it was weird, Vanessa started as she licked her lips, that some people who've been going missing the last few years were heard talking about visiting this place. How is that possible? I hounded her without meaning to, my stare intense. Didn't that raise any red flags with anyone? It did, but whenever people came investigating, there was no sign of them being here. None at all. Vanessa's eyes glazed over as she spoke the horrible truth. I've read all about it. The police always ended up saying it was more plausible they went missing on the way here because they never found any evidence the missing people even made it here. It's almost like this place just erases all of it, hides it. I turned to Yasmin. We know how to stop this. We just need to find an old school backpack and a pink purse. It should have 2 of the kids' eyes in it. It's like a curse. If we get rid of it at the root, the victims of the eye ripper, I'm sure it'll set off a chain reaction and then everyone will be free, dead or alive. This isn't a fucking movie, Grace. I was shocked by Yasmin's hardened tone and the way she stared at me. What you're doing is called wishful thinking. What? I looked at her like she was out of her mind. Stop it. You saw how we survived the Jenkins girl. She took her eyes back and left, and we haven't seen her since. She's gone from here. She's been appeased. And listen, there's something I need to tell you both. They looked at me curiously. I took a deep breath and broke the bad news about what I had seen on the camera. They didn't believe me until I instructed Vanessa to rewind to that part of the footage, and they saw it for themselves. Oh my God, Yasmin choked out, clamping her hands over her mouth and closing her eyes as more tears squeezed from them. We were talking to them, and the entire time they were dead. Vanessa ran her quivering fingers through her hair. So they're just walking corpses? Yasmin bawled. Zombies or something? What the fuck is this place? She looked like she wanted to have a breakdown. Both of them did. But I knew I couldn't afford to let them do that if I wanted to go through with my plan. We couldn't afford to waste any more time grieving. Listen, I said, shaking Yasmin's shoulders gently to snap her out of it. We can't stay here and cry. We have to. Those 2 women fucking died here, didn't they? Yasmin was suddenly invading my bubble, almost nose to nose with me with an angry glare. What if you're wrong and we have to appease them too? What if there's a lot more than just them? How many people do you think tried to tour the house where one of the worst murder cases of the state happened over the last several years? Yes, this isn't you. I shook my head. You're optimistic. You're strong. You were the one who suggested finding their eyes in the first place. I'm also the one who brought you all here to begin with. Her voice cracked, and the furious expression on her face melted into one of deep sorrow. The idiot that got Zach and Bryce, John's friend and my boyfriend, killed. She turned away, refusing to let us see her wipe away her tears. Don't sell yourself short, Yazzie. Vanessa smiled and stepped forward, putting a hand on my friend's shoulder. You didn't know. In an unexpected turn of events, Yasmin spun around and planted a hard smack on Vanessa's cheek, stunning her. You two-timing bitch, you think that means anything coming from you? Her hoarse voice shrilled. Keep it down. I shushed her, putting myself between the 2. Yasmin shoved me out the way, cornering Vanessa. I know you've been messing around with my boyfriend behind my back. Everyone said you were the easiest girl in school, a real skank, but I didn't listen, and I got tired of seeing your pitiful ass being left out all the time, so I made you my friend. Vanessa started crying. Afraid of being the object of Yasmin's wrath, I cowered away and meekly said, Look, this isn't the best time to do this. Let's get out of here, and then you can tear her a new one. The last thing he ever did to me was turn his face away when I tried to kiss him. Yasmin grabbed Vanessa's throat and pushed her against the wall. Her fingers didn't tighten to strangle her, but rather they simply pinned her in place. All night, you 2 were acting like you were the ones dating. He's dead, and I can't even remember him as a loyal boyfriend. Watching this unfold and seeing Vanessa pathetically weep without even struggling, a fire started to burn in me. I always let Yasmin get her way and let her drag me into things, and I was sick of being submissive. I wasn't going to stand there and let her devolve everything into chaos after I worked to keep us all in this together. Our lives were in danger. People were dead, and we didn't need this petty high school drama. "Get your hands off her, Yaz," I shouted as I pried my friend's fingers from my rival's throat. Yasmin looked at me, shocked. "There's no time for this." I added in a quieter voice, "Things are trying to kill us, and this is what you're worried about? Look, I'm sorry to say it, but I had already told you I thought Bryce wasn't good for you. I mean, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but it needed to be said. And Vanessa has always been a jerk, so I don't know why you ever expected anything from her." Vanessa rubbed her arm up and down awkwardly, clearly disliking my insult, but not having the guts to protest about it. "You're better than this." I pushed Yasmin's dark hair out her face, and I'm sure if Bryce were here, he'd tell you he was sorry, however genuine it may be. I rolled my eyes, "And after this is over, you can dump Vanessa as a friend and never have to speak to her again. But until then, you have to keep it together so we can get the hell out of here." Yasmin didn't break my stare for a few moments. Finally, she sighed and murmured, "Okay, so what are we doing?" "Going back to that basement and finding a pink purse and a backpack that may have belonged to Sarah and Peter," I replied, relieved she was behaving herself. "They likely have their eyes in them. It's worth a shot." "Fine, then let's do it. Let's do it and get out of here." She walked out the room and suddenly turned to Vanessa to jab a finger at her face. "And after this, you're back to being a loser slut." Vanessa didn't answer, but by the look on her face, she seemed hurt, despite her own betrayal. As we went down the hall, I explained John's absence to Yasmin, who seemed exasperated that he had truly left on his own on a futile suicide mission, and then we gathered our courage to leave that house which had seemed like a safe haven. We went downstairs, our steps quiet, and towards the utility room where the back door lay. A white solid door and a screen door behind it, in the right-hand corner of a small rectangular area where a washing machine, dryer, and pantry was located. I was in the lead, and I silently opened the first door. The window of the screen door revealed the overgrown backyard, drenched in darkness and just barely lit with moonlight from a full moon. At this time, you should have been able to hear the nightly cacophony of nocturnal insects, maybe even seen fireflies, but there was no sign of life whatsoever. It felt like someone had hit the mute button of the remote on the world, same as you would to a movie. I hated it more than anything, as it made it feel all the more lonely. The girl's right behind me. I tried to open the screen door as quietly as possible, but since it was aged, rusted, and weathered, it would not yield without sound. The hinges squeaked, the door's groan increasing in pitch and volume as I eased it outward. We all cringed visibly, with Vanessa being at the back and looking over her shoulder, and Yasmin and I peeking around the backyard, which hadn't been tended to in quite some time. There was no one, dead or otherwise. We stepped onto the cement doorstep one by one, and then our feet tread long and dead grass, which should have been teeming with buds but wasn't. We crept to the edge of the left side of the house, where several feet of wide-open space lay between us and the Eye Ripper house's back door. We would be vulnerable, shadowed by the treetops, but still highlighted by moonlight and uncovered by any building. Anything could spot us, and we had to work our nerves up before we could even think about making a run for it. I peeked around the corner of the wall to be sure the street, or at least how much I could see of it, was empty. What came next happened so fast it makes my head spin just thinking about it in the present. First, a scream rang out from Vanessa and Yasmin, and I followed her terrified gaze over to the tree line at the edge of the backyard. I noticed the pink shirt and long blonde hair right off the bat. Sarah Miller's ghoulish face was soaked in shadow as it stared lifelessly at us. She was so still, she may as well have been a doll, made to stand upright between two trees. My mind shifting to autopilot as the scared animal inside me yearned to get as far as possible. I turned to run, only to be face to face with the visage of the eyeless brunette boy, William. I felt his fingers dig into my eyes, and I blindly shoved him away with a shout of pain and ran. I was heading for the Eye Ripper house, and I could hear Vanessa and Yasmin screaming as they followed me. The back door was getting tantalizingly closer. Then it opened, and Zach walked out. The illusion was broken, and it was very clear to us that he was missing his eyes as well. What he was doing in the house, I had no idea, but as soon as he saw us, his face balled up, and he burst into tears while charging at us. The tears were made of blood, and his mouth stiffly moved with his whimpers as his sockets narrowed from being pushed down by his furrowed eyebrows. "The car!" Yasmin screamed, grabbing my hand and dragging me towards the street. "Grace!" Zach called, his voice on the verge of breaking with emotion, but not quite there yet. I couldn't take my eyes off him as he flailed his arms outwardly while running to catch up with us. "I got away!" His voice heightened in pitch with a sense of deranged euphoria, and he smiled. "Thank Christ, I got away. I did. I got away, Grace. I did." We were almost to the car when Vanessa shrieked as she got yanked backwards by Bryce, who wrapped his arms around her neck and face with his fingers wriggling for her eyes like worms. She closed her eyes and tried to force his hands off her, crying out in terror. Yasmin pushed me towards the car and launched herself at him, wrestling him off of Vanessa and tackling him to the ground. I hurriedly climbed into the driver's side of John's car as a crying Vanessa scrambled backwards on the asphalt, watching my friend fight the ghost. Seeing her in this state, I got out of the car and grabbed her under her arms, pulling her into the driver's side seat. "Come on, Vanessa, hurry!" I screeched, white-hot panic flashing through me at the sight of all the wraiths we'd encountered, heading right for us. Zach was running clumsily like a madman, Sarah was gliding forward an inch off the ground, and William was crawling and scrabbling along the pavement like an oversized spider. Once Vanessa was in the seat, she closed the door, and I was about to get in myself. But I turned to see Yaz still struggling with Bryce. He stuck a finger and thumb into her right socket, trying to pluck her eye out, and the still night air was filled with cries of pain. Quickly, I yanked Bryce off of her by his hair and shoved my fingers into his eye sockets, hoping to stun him. It felt freezing cold inside and wet, but when I took my fingers out, they weren't wet at all. "Don't leave us," Bryce begged, his voice flowing out his gaping mouth without his lips moving. He slowly stood up. "We need you." Just as the others descended upon us, I helped Yasmin to her feet and we scrambled into the car, shutting and locking the doors behind us. We were now trapped, with eyeless wraiths surrounding us, including our former friends. They put their hands against the windows and pressed their faces into the glass, making sure we felt their hollow stares piercing deep into our beings. Then, after a short while, Sarah was beside my window, covering her face with her hands again, but facing me as if she was ready to play a game of peekaboo with a baby. William decided to crawl up the hood of the vehicle and onto the roof, his face frozen in an expression that reminded me of the ghost face mask. He simply crawled around up there without end. Then Peter, as if he'd been told fresh eyes were for sale by the others, was standing a few feet away from the car and simply watching intently. Bryce and Zach paced in slow circles around us, meandering with emotionless expressions. We all refused to look at them, instead choosing to either look down at our laps or at each other. Vanessa let the camera go limp in her hands as she buried her face in her lap, giving up on recording for the time being. Yasmin pulled her hood to her sweat jacket over her head and covered her eyes with her hair. I looked up at the ceiling of the car, thinking over my life choices which led me here. "We have to escape," Yasmin suddenly said after a while, turning to look at me in the back seat. "How?" I asked without looking at her, annoyed at her just saying the obvious. "I'm also open to suggestions," Vanessa said as she watched William crawl from the roof down the hood for the 100th time. "I'm gonna lead them away," Yasmin replied, making us both gawk at her like she was crazy. She noticed our look and sighed. "I've thought about it long and hard, and I'm gonna make a run for it. I'm gonna run around one of these roads and keep all of them distracted long enough for you two to find what you're looking for." "That's insane," Vanessa said. "I want to see if I can find John out there anyways," Yasmin replied. "I don't want to leave without him, and he's the muscle of the group." "You think you can really outrun all of them?" I asked incredulously. "I run track, Grace," she smiled weakly at me. "Even in death, those lamos can't beat me, and if I run out of breath, I'll hide. Or maybe I might even make it out somehow and I can get help. Either way, I'm doing this. I got us into this mess, so I'm gonna take one for the team. Don't try to stop me, okay? My eyes started to water and I sniffed. You don't fucking die on us, okay? I sternly snapped at her. We'll do this, and you're gonna escape with us, all right? All right? Yasmin leaned over to hug me tightly. Her embrace felt warm and comforting, as it always had. I'm sorry about Bryce, Yasmin, Vanessa said, refusing to make eye contact, and it was clear she wasn't just talking about his loss. Yeah. Yasmin nodded, then faced forward and took several deep breaths. She waited for Bryce to pass by her door, and before Zach could make it around, she slammed open the door and ran out. Vanessa quickly shut it behind her. All the entities stopped their creepy activities and watched her for a moment, then immediately gave chase in their respective ways. Vanessa and I held our breaths as we watched Yasmin lead them down the street, past the abandoned houses and into the crossroads. She continued straight on, knowing it would only bring her back. Let's go. I climbed out the car with Vanessa and we ran into the Eye Ripper house through the front door. There seemed to be no wraiths in sight. Not right at that moment, at least. One story ends, but the nightmare never truly stops. It only changes shape. Letters from the Crystal Shore. The letter was just there. No return address, no knock at the door, nothing. It was late one night, roughly a week ago, and I woke up thirsty, so I went into my kitchen to grab some water. To say that my apartment is small is an understatement. After the few months I had lived there, I could navigate it with my eyes closed, and that night I was doing just that. The only break in the darkness was the red glow of the stove as it displayed the time. I didn't bother to check. I knew it was late. All I wanted was a cold glass of water. After practically inhaling it, I turned to my sink to place my cup inside, but a piece of parchment caught my eye. Right in the middle of the empty table, save a spoon and some crumpled napkins from dinner, was an envelope. Even in my tired state, I knew this was strange, as I couldn't recall that being there before I had gone to bed. When even was the last time I got mail? I picked it up and started to inspect it for any identifiable information. There wasn't anything I could see, just a blank old yellowed envelope that was oddly cold to touch, like it had been shoved in someone's freezer. It was odd, but I was too tired to care at the time. However, I wasn't tired enough to put it down. Opening the letter, I grabbed and pulled out a single piece of paper that was also yellowed and cracked in places. Unfolding it, I found that it was filled with all sorts of strange drawings and symbols. To me, they looked like some hieroglyphic language from Egypt or the like. But what did I know? The symbols, I could at least tell what they were, was a spiral, a staff, and finally a skull, which I assumed belonged to a predator based on its sharp incisors. The glyphs were drawn with something similar to charcoal, but it looked wrong. It had the right texture when I ran my fingers over it, but it was darker and runny somehow, almost like oil. I leaned closer to get a whiff of it, because why not, and breathed in some of the excess dust. Instantly, my throat felt like particles of glass were fighting to see who could travel the deepest. I bent over, coughing and hacking so hard that I was beginning to see white spots in my vision. And before I knew it, I had collapsed on my kitchen floor and the lights went out. Waves were crashing behind me, and I was buffeted by the scent of salt and something else, something that smelled old, like a leather shoe, and rancid. I made an attempt to turn only to realize, like a statue, I was firmly held in place. I could only stare forward and move my eyes some. Around me, I noticed sand that glistened like diamonds. They were so clear that it almost hurt to look at. Luckily, there was some cloud cover overhead that blocked the sun, because I'm sure if that wasn't the case, the refraction of light off the sand would have cooked me through. Further past the shoreline were trees that looked burned and charred, which didn't pair well with the lively green leaves. Then the leaves began to move and shift. There was a good breeze blowing, but to the leaves, it seemed optional for them to follow its path. Some appeared to practically spin around in circles, contradicting the leaf right next to it, spinning the opposite way. Others waved like water, rippling impossibly, or sputtered and sparked like flames. Pain began to blossom behind my eyes the more I watched, so I went back to staring at the small refined crystals at my feet. I began trying to make sense of where I was or what might be happening, but couldn't. My head felt cloudy and closed off, like trying to look through frosted glass to read a page out of a book. There was a light, rocky crunch behind me. My muscles tightened. Then there was another footfall, a little closer this time. I tried to move, but my concrete limbs rejected the idea. I strained as hard as I could, which ended up exacerbating the pain in my head. This fruitless fight continued all the way up until I felt some of the sand brush my ankles as 2 feet landed right behind me. A cold sweat began to break out on my forehead, and my stomach started kneading itself into knots. Warm air tickled the back of my neck. A small squeal managed to squeeze itself past my lips. Then the smell hit me. It was rotten, like roadkill that had baked in the sun for a week and was filled with maggots. It was a test of will to hold my breath in order to keep the bile threatening to rise down. Old rattling laughter began to sound behind me. It was hoarse and gravelly, and it somehow encompassed me and made me feel like an insect in front of a rhino. I began again, frantically trying to force my body to move. Every muscle I had was straining beyond belief, but still I got no reprieve. Eventually I exhausted myself and felt myself shrink back into being an obedient statue. I was out of options, and that thing was just standing behind me now, no longer laughing or even breathing from what I could hear. "Hello," I muttered out, sounding like some whimpering animal. There was a moment of stillness, then the air behind me shifted as something truly large moved, and then a hand rested itself on the back of my neck. Just the palm at first, then 2 long fingers began to wrap all the way around my throat, stopping just shy of covering my Adam's apple. The fingers were slick and oily. There were also small tendrils of what I didn't want to think about, pressing into my flesh, trying to burrow into me. Then at once it lifted off of me, the little tendrils making popping sounds as they loosened. The reprieve was only momentary. Next thing I knew, there was a sharp and pointed jabbing into my spine right at the base of my neck that seared like molten metal where it entered my body. I woke up screaming. Luckily, it was almost morning, because after that, there wasn't any hope of returning to sleep. I had 2 classes that day that passed by in a blur. My body felt as if someone had taken a spoon to my head and scraped my insides out. The rest of the day was spent in the same fashion. I got home, didn't have the stomach to eat anything, and then spent the rest of the evening in bed. The next day, however, I felt right as rain, like nothing had happened. And the next day, I barely even thought about the dream or the paper. Soon, a whole week had passed. I still had the letter. When I woke up and regained a little bit of my senses, I had found it folded up neatly sitting on the floor near where I had taken my involuntary nap. My logical brain told me that there was no way a note with pictures could do that. But the lizard part of my brain was whispering that something was up, so I hadn't opened it all week. Finally, on a Saturday morning, I decided to take another peek. I gave myself the whole pep talk about being a man and worked up some courage and grabbed the note. My hands shook a little as my fingers grabbed the edge of the folded paper. Then, after whispering a silent prayer, I pulled it open. My eyes had closed somewhere in this process, and I was mentally chastising myself before finally taking a peek. My brows furrowed. The page that had been filled with strange, arcane drawings and symbols was now blank. I rubbed my eyes, then turned the page over and over, expecting to see a hint of the old charcoal writing, but nothing. Not even a speck of the black dusting that had been on the page. I put the paper back down, laughed a little at my own expense, folded it back up, then the next day threw it out. Another week went by, and I had practically forgotten the note. The only reminders were when I would catch a scent of something rotten and feel a phantom of that decayed breath tickle the back of my neck. I was up early one morning getting ready to go to class. I was reaching for the door when something slightly yellow caught my eye. The door handle began to rattle slightly before I removed my hand. At first, I tried to reason with myself. Surely it was just a yellow plate or a pot. I would have taken anything other than what I was positive was sitting on my stove. Slowly I turned to it. I blinked a few times to make sure I was seeing correctly. There it was, Another envelope was resting on my stove, ancient and yellow, just like the last. I walked over to it. Why I did what I did next, I couldn't say. I just felt like I had to. It was like something gripped me and I became no more than a marionette. I couldn't stop myself. Before I even registered what was happening, I was already holding the paper. The scent of ash hit me. I knew what I would see if I opened it, and my body did it anyway. Familiar waves crashed behind me. A similar scene was laid out before me. There were a few differences, however. It was dark out now, unlike the foggy gray of before. I could only see now thanks to a large moon overhead, one much bigger than I was used to seeing. A purple moon pockmarked with truly gargantuan craters that put the moon's battered surface to shame. It was absolutely stunning. I lost myself just taking it in for a while until a subtle scent wafted in on a breeze. My moment of admiration was ruined as my heart began to jackhammer. The visibility was terrible, just the faint outline of the forest painted against a background devoid of anything. I tried to walk and couldn't. Like last time, my legs felt bolted down by an unseen force. However, I did notice I could turn my head slightly. I looked from side to side, not seeing anyone. I was grateful, but I knew that I wasn't in the clear with the scent lingering in my surroundings. It was heavy and awful and seemed to permeate my skin and dig into my body with each inhale. I could just barely make out the small waves crashing behind me. It seemed that this was some kind of beach. Definitely not the build-a-whole resort on kind. It stretched on and on into the distance. I couldn't tell where it ended. Little glimmers of purple shone out in the darkness, creating false stars on the ground, where the moon's light reflected on the grains of crystalline sand. The water was dark, seemingly pitch black, and it didn't look quite like water either. There wasn't any reflective qualities to it like you would normally see on a beach. The water looked and rolled onto the beach more like oil than anything, utterly absorbing in the moon's light before diving deep down into the sand and slowly pulling back out into the sea to repeat the same process over and over again. Strange, isn't it? A voice that wasn't mine sounded behind me as a wave of fetid air hit my back. I stilled, my back muscles pulled together so hard that if I wasn't frozen in place, my shoulders would be touching. My eyes and head turned, attempting to see who was speaking, but couldn't quite turn far enough. A chuff of amusement came from behind. "Do you want to see me that bad? Human, I can assure you that you would come to regret that decision," he chuckled, a deep grating sound. My visage invokes reactions that aren't suitable for minds like yours. After a moment of silent contemplation, I managed to ask, "Are you the one sending me these letters?" "What letters?" he asked in almost a sing-song voice before a deep guttural laugh cut through the night. The air was growing thicker with the acrid stench. "Oh, you mean those little old things. I suppose you could say I'm sending them to you if you wish, though that's not entirely true." "What do you mean?" "I guess your story must be at least a little bit interesting." He paused, and I heard a scratching sound. "Or you will be able to create one that is." He stopped speaking, and I was growing tired. I tried to think about what he might mean, but the harder I thought, the more pain erupted in my mind just behind my eyes. I knew that my life wasn't that exciting. In fact, the only interesting thing to happen since I started school were these letters. I'd call myself pretty average, honestly, just going through the motions of life. Or at least I was. He mused, and I felt a hand rest on the nape of my neck. I suppose a little look-see won't hurt. I began to feel little pricks of ice on my flesh, like small mouths latching onto me. They began to wiggle and writhe. "Oh, and one more thing before you go. Why don't you check out a library sometime? You might find some insight there." He paused. "Or not." Boisterous laughter cut into the night. It was so loud and cruel. I opened my mouth again to speak, but didn't get anything out before a line of molten fire pierced my body and my eyes burst open back in my kitchen, where I promptly cried out in agony. The pain lingered. It wasn't like this last time. I ran to the bathroom and splashed some cold water on my face. I looked gaunt and pale, like some of my soul had been sucked out of me. My back was on fire, so I rotated slightly and froze. Just at the bottom, right where my neck met the collar of my shirt, was an angry red X right over my spine. If you think that was terrifying, Wait until you hear what happened next. The Transformation of Professor Ismay Part 1. I've been fascinated with insects for as long as I can remember. When I was a child, I used to collect caterpillars from my yard and keep them in a fish tank in my bedroom. I'd feed them until they grew fat, and when they formed their cocoons, I would sketch them as I eagerly awaited their transformation into butterflies and moths. Once upon a time, this process would absolutely enthrall me. How something so small and meager could become something so beautiful was, to me at least, one of nature's greatest magic tricks. But now, as I write this from my hospital bed, I have come to understand why God was so selective when deciding which of his creations would perform this great miracle. In the wrong form, that miracle was nothing short of a blight, a curse, a damnation, and something that I, ashamedly, engaged with, encouraged, and observed. Allow me to explain. For the sake of my anonymity, I'll refer to myself as John Smith. Also, you should assume that any other name I mention is a pseudonym. It's just safer that way. I live in the northwest of England. I won't say exactly where for your own safety, because I know a few of you will go looking after what I tell you. But know that it is a picturesque area of outstanding natural beauty that sees many tourists from all over the country all year round. There are mountains aplenty, lakes and rivers, vast swathes of woodland, and quaint little towns and villages nestled between the many great wrinkles of the land. Amongst these many towns and villages, you will find large manor houses here and there. They mostly belong to wealthy families who enjoy the peaceful bliss of nature, safely hidden away from the hustle and bustle of larger cities found further south. After a brief stint in the forces, where I worked as a chef, I decided to focus my efforts towards a career in catering. Those wealthy families, they don't cook for themselves, or rather, they won't. In a city, they would find an abundance of restaurants of nearly every variety that would bend over backwards for the contents of their wallets. In a village, unless they had no issues with eating at the same pub restaurant every night, they would have to cook their own food, which they didn't do. It was somehow beneath them. That's where I came in. I would go from house to house, cooking for and catering to those wealthy families for months at a time, nearly every day, for almost 5 years after I left the army. Things were going well. I made a bit of a reputation for myself, and business was consistent. Then, for no reason whatsoever, the work began to dry up. Families that were previously all too keen to have me serve them suddenly stopped calling. I called around, made apologies, though I was unsure what for, and even offered my services at a lower rate, but nothing came through. Nobody wanted me anymore. It was as if I had suddenly become a nuisance to these people. More on that later. I still don't understand it. I was known well enough. My services were always well received, and I'd never had any complaints. I thought for sure it was just a dry spell, that I would see the other side of it, but I was wrong. It was becoming apparent that working as a rent-a-chef was suddenly not a viable option anymore, so I considered a different line of work. I searched job listings online for anything within 10 miles or so. I'd work construction, sweep streets, anything at all, just to get some cash flowing. God knows I needed the money. My applications were ignored. Time and time again, I was denied interviews and callbacks. I had started to believe that I was cursed. At that point, I'd gone almost 3 months without any source of income. My savings were nearly spent. I'd fallen behind on my utility bills, and I hadn't been able to pay my rent for the previous month. My landlord wasn't known for his charitable attitude, and I had run out of time. I wouldn't last another month. I couldn't. I'd almost given up hope that I would work again. Then I received a letter in the mail one Monday morning. It read, "Dear Mr. Smith, you do not know me, but I know you. I know that you are a chef and that you are looking for work. If you would lend my family your services, I will gladly pay you thrice your usual fees. All I would ask is that you reply promptly and that you speak of this to no one. Come before nightfall. The choice is yours. Make it quickly." On the back of the letter was an address for a manor house, one I had never heard of before. It wasn't too far, only around 9 miles away, though it was off the beaten track a little bit. If I knew before I started what I know now, I would have stuck with my original plan and looked for work elsewhere. But 3 times my usual fee? at a time when I needed money the most. There was no way I was going to turn it down. God, I wish I had. Day 1. It took 2 buses to get there. I arrived at the house later that same Monday, somewhere around 4. I found the house hiding in the woods, down a graveled road that led away from the main village road not far from the bus stop. It was a large building, nestled in the trees by a lake. With its towers, terraces, and black slate roofs, it was like something from the Addams Family, the kind of place that screams generational wealth. I knocked on the heavy wooden door and waited. Soon enough, a little old lady answered the door. She was small, hunched over, and softly spoken. Her wrinkled eyes peeked over her dainty golden glasses that sat perched on the ridge of her nose. She shivered in the breeze. In a way, she reminded me of my grandmother. "Sorry to disturb you, I've come about a job," I said. "Very good, Mr. Smith, come in," she replied. And as simple as that, I was through the door. The old lady asked me to wait, and she shuffled off into another room at the rear of the large foyer I found myself in. The house was grand, to say the least. I've never seen so much polished wood and such expensive furnishings, and I've seen the inside of more than a few mansions, let me tell you. After a minute or so, the old lady returned. Alongside her walked another woman, though she was much younger. I'd soon learn that she was the one who'd written to me. "Mr. Smith?" the younger woman said. I smiled and shook her hand, told her it was a pleasure to meet her. "My name is Elizabeth Ismay," she said. "I'd like to get right to it if it's all the same to you." "Not a problem," I said. She led me through the foyer and into the kitchen at the rear of the house. Now, when I say kitchen, I don't mean that it was one stove, a fridge, a microwave, and some countertops. This was the kitchen to rival all kitchens. Imagine any appliance and it was there, except the Ismay's was better. Imagine the biggest kitchen you've ever seen, and then double it again. I'd seen smaller kitchens in Michelin star restaurants in London. Elizabeth allowed me to take in my surroundings, and after I'd picked my jaw up from the floor, she spoke again. "This is where you will work, Mr. Smith. Monday to Saturday, 10 till 7 every day. You have free reign over the kitchen and all its appliances. The menu is already decided, and the food will be supplied. All you need to do is prepare it, cook it, and serve it." I didn't want to work that much, but I didn't want to be homeless and jobless either. "Okay," I managed. "Can I see the menu?" She motioned with her hand towards one of the counters where a stack of laminated A4 sheets of paper sat. In all honesty, I thought at that moment that it was some kind of joke. Each sheet was filled from top to bottom with meat-only dishes. And I genuinely mean meat only. Not one vegetable, not a drop of sauce or gravy, no side dishes or sweets or drinks or anything. Just meat, meat and more meat, all the way down. I glanced up at Elizabeth as she stood silently in the doorway. She was expressionless and still. This was no joke. "Who am I cooking for?" I asked. She paused a moment before simply saying, "My father." "Your father?" She nodded. "There will be rules, Mr. Smith," she said, beckoning me to follow her. I left the menus where I found them and stepped after her. It was at this moment I should have left. I was already a little freaked out, and you didn't need to be a chef to understand why this whole meat-only menu was bizarre. But again, the money was on my mind. She took me into the foyer and we stood beneath a large portrait painting of an elderly man in a large leather chair. On a polished brass plaque at its base it read, "Professor Bernard Ismay." "My father," she said, pointing. "He was the foremost authority of entomology in his prime. He studied at Oxford and eventually taught there." I nodded as I glanced up at him. He looked exactly what you would imagine an elderly multimillionaire looked like. Stern-faced, with a grimace of self-superiority. "I really must insist on your discretion, Mr. Smith. Can I rely on you to be discreet?" Elizabeth asked. I nodded again. "My father is unwell, you see," she continued. "For quite some time now, he has been undergoing something of a change." "What do you mean?" I asked. She glanced up at the portrait and cleared her throat a little. "Over time, it seems that he has begun to hate the taste of, well, ordinary food. He won't stand for vegetables or fruits, will not even consider rice or grains. He desires only meat. As of late, he has become difficult to live with." "Why?" I asked. "We're not sure," she said. "No one can understand why. He's seen doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, I have given up wondering if I'm being completely honest. It's better to accept the situation for what it is, we've found. What situation? What's going on? I asked. Can I trust you, Mr. Smith? Yes, I said. Then give me your phone, she said, holding out her hand. Why? Does your phone have a camera? She asked. I nodded. Then please, she said, holding out her hand. I hesitated at first, but eventually handed it to her. I knew she wasn't going to rob me. I needed only to look around to understand that she had no interest in a phone worth less than the shoes she wore. And besides, curiosity had taken hold. Follow me, she said, and please be quiet. Do not speak unless I say so. We climbed the stairs together. As I followed behind her, I noticed the little old lady was staring at me from the corner of a doorway behind us. She looked concerned. Truth be told, like a child awaiting punishment from an angry parent in another room. The walls of the stairwell were covered in framed pictures of Professor Ismay as a younger man. He was often in the presence of other academics, standing outside of what I assume was his university. In others, he was in forests and jungles, standing with various native people, or holding some sort of insect for the camera to see. A man after my own heart, it would seem, though his circumstances were so far beyond anything I'd ever known. At the top of the stairs was a large wooden panel door with metal hinges that extended across the full width of its face. It was bolted shut at the top and bottom with thick iron bolts, and there was a strange smell coming from within. Elizabeth motioned for me to be quiet. There was a small table to our left with a drawer. Beside that was a metal food trolley on wheels that was covered in scratch marks, as though a pack of dogs had fought across it for scraps. Elizabeth opened the table drawer, pulled out a can of silicone spray lubricant that you might find in an engineer's toolbox, and doused each of the 3 hinges with it before slowly unbolting the door. Movies would have you believe that wooden doors creak when they open, and that it is somehow creepier for doing so. But believe me when I tell you, when a large wooden door the size of a dining table opens in complete silence to a near pitch-black room, there isn't much else scarier in this world. I glanced at Elizabeth and nearly asked her right then and there what the hell was this all about, but I could see there was a fear in her eyes. A deep, almost primal fear of the unknown, like that of a child hiding from monsters beneath their bed. I stayed silent and simply glanced inside as she did. As my eyes adjusted, I could faintly make out the shape of a bed at the rear of the room. The curtains were drawn, and there was no source of light whatsoever. No lamps, no candles, nothing. There was a cold breeze that rolled out towards us, gripping my ankles and running up my back like the caress of a lover. I found that I was breathing heavier, and my fingers were twitching. The worst part was the smell. As a chef, you get used to the smell of rotten food from time to time. But this was something else. It almost made me cough as it struck me in the back of my throat. I tried to stifle it, but I couldn't. As a small noise escaped my throat, I noticed some movement on the bed. There was a strange metallic clink, a slight groan, and in the dark of the room, I saw 2 minuscule white dots appear, reflecting the light from behind us. What I can only assume were eyes, observed me in the doorway before the sound of shuffling began. Before I could do anything else, Elizabeth pulled the door shut and bolted it. Inside, there began a slow thudding sound that grew louder and louder, as though someone was walking our way with slow, labored footsteps. A drag and a thump. A drag and a thump. Is there something wrong with your father? I asked. Let's go, quickly, Elizabeth said. She handed me my phone back as we descended the stairs. I had no idea what the hell I'd just seen in there, and I had no intention of finding out. Elizabeth saw me to the door, and as I began my polite but firm refusal to accept the job, she offered to pay me 5 times my normal fee. 3 meals a day, she said, Monday to Saturday. Simply wheel the food through the door on the trolley, close the door, and wait for my father to finish eating before you retrieve the trolley again. Why are you offering me this job? I asked. You wrote me a letter saying you know me, but how? And what is wrong with your father? I was irate and made no attempt to hide it. Mr. Smith, me and my family have been searching for someone like you for a long time. We simply cannot provide the service for my father that I know you are capable of, and your name came my way from a website that matches employers with potential employees. Are you looking for work or not? What is wrong with that man up there? I asked again. That man up there is my father, she said sternly. To you, he is Professor Ismay. As I said before, he is very ill, and I did not want us to disturb him. If you're concerned about contagion, then do not be. You will be perfectly safe as long as you follow the rules. Now, if it's all the same to you, I would have your answer. Will you cook for my father, or do you have other prospects? I thought about it for a moment. What else could I do? Day 2, I started the next day. After a good night's rest, I was not as unsettled as I had been the day before, though I was not completely comfortable with the situation either. I thought about Professor Ismay on the journey to the house. I thought about the fear in Elizabeth's eyes as we stood in his bedroom doorway. Mostly I thought about the money. I had a tendency to overthink things, and it usually sent my anxiety through the roof. Just cook and serve is what I told myself. Just cook and serve. I just needed to hold on for something else, something normal. Then I would leave and be okay. When I arrived, it was as she had promised. The kitchen fridges were stocked with meats of all varieties. Some local, some more exotic. Beef, venison, wild boar, kangaroo. There were even a couple of packs of puffin breast meat, shipped straight from Iceland earlier that week. Elizabeth insisted that my phone be placed in a locker in the corner of the room for the whole day. She said she didn't want anything to potentially disturb her father. I wasn't glued to it or anything, so I didn't mind. I did notice that there was a security camera in the top corner of the room. They must have had issues in the past with other chefs, but I didn't ask. I'm pretty sure that Elizabeth and the little old lady, who it turns out is called Agnes, are the only people who live in that big house, besides Professor Ismay, of course. So far, I haven't seen anyone else there at all. I started at 10, and by 12 I had finished the first section of the first menu. Fried beefsteaks, blue rare, roasted chicken breasts, and a chunky pork joint. The menu came with instructions on how to serve the meal too. These were arguably more strange than the food itself. They read, "The prepared meats will be placed together in the large round metal bowl provided. No utensils or napkins are required, and no seasonings of any kind are to accompany the food. The bowl is then to be placed in the center of the metal trolley. After lubricating the door hinges with the silicone spray, the door may be unbolted and opened carefully. The trolley is wheeled no more than 10 feet into the room, where the server will then ring a small handheld bell. The server will then leave promptly, taking the bell and locking the door shut behind them. The server will then return to the kitchen for at least an hour and wait for the professor to finish eating. Do not disturb the professor. Do not speak to the professor. Do not return before 1 hour. No deviations from the rules under any circumstances." Never before have I had to deal with anything like this. It was absurd, but undeniably intriguing. What I couldn't understand was, well, it was a lot of food, easily an 8-person meal, and I was supposed to believe that one sick old man was going to eat it all? And it was only the first of 3 meals that day. I fully expected to be throwing away quite a lot of food. I was wrong. I prepared the meats and filled the bowl, then set about carrying it upstairs to the waiting trolley by Professor Ismay's door. On the trolley was the bell. About the size of a cola can, it was a dull silver with a black wooden handle. I placed the bowl on the trolley and pushed it to the door. From the little table drawer, I retrieved the silicone spray, and imitating what I'd seen the day before, I lubricated the hinges before unbolting the door and pushing it open slowly. The same cold breeze from the day before took hold of me as the smell entered my nose. It was foul, like rot and human filth. Once again, I couldn't see anything inside. It was nearly pitch black. I wheeled the trolley into the room about 10 feet, or what I thought was 10 feet, then gave the bell a quick shake. Ironically, its jingle was quite jolly. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked backwards towards the door, keeping my eyes fixed forward into that dark abyss. As expected, there was movement in the dark. Slowly, as if burdened by the weight of his own body, the professor slunk from his bed. His movements sounded wet and heavy. The stench worsened tenfold, as though the professor's movement disturbed something deep within that dark room, unleashing a greater torrent of whatever filth befouled the air. I saw only the faint glow of his eyes as he shuffled my way before I closed the door and bolted it quickly. Inside, as I pressed my ear to the door, I could hear a clicking sound, like a Geiger counter, but larger and with a deeper sound. I could hear the faint, wet smacking of lips and teeth, and the horrid gurgling rumble of the professor's eating. As I turned, I jumped. Elizabeth stood at the top of the stairs. She motioned angrily for me to follow her, and I did. I expected to be chastised in some way. I had broken the rules after all, and on my first day too. Instead, she gently asked me to remember the rules and sent me back into the kitchen. I waited in there for an hour and 10 minutes. I'd cleaned everything, prepared as much as I could for the second meal, and after that was done, I was just standing there, biding my time. I glanced out of the rear window at the garden. They had rows upon rows of wildflowers. At the back of the garden were around a dozen wooden hives for honeybees. I could see them faintly, black dots upon the breeze here and there, gathering their nectar. They had it easy. Upstairs I could hear thumping, dragging and thumping and the clinking of metal. I turned, and in the doorway to the kitchen was Agnes, glancing over her little glasses at me with a shy smile. "The master's finished, my love," she said. I checked my watch and gave her a slight nod and a smile, and made my way towards the stairway. Before I could pass Agnes, she placed her hand on my arm and stopped me. I noticed her hand was wrapped in bandages. I don't remember if it had been the day before. We locked eyes, and she leaned in to whisper, "Be careful." I didn't know what to say other than, "Okay." I climbed the stairs, and Agnes watched from the doorway to the kitchen until I was out of her sight. I hadn't seen Elizabeth since our earlier encounter, and when I reached the professor's door, I felt quite alone. I pressed my ear to the door. I couldn't hear anything inside. I lubricated the hinges once more and unbolted the door. I held on to that handle with all my strength. I was fully prepared to pull it shut as fast as I could. As the door opened slowly and the cold caressed my face, I peered into that foul-smelling blackness. I allowed the door to open only a foot or so, just until the trolley was visible. It was as I had left it, as well as the bowl on top. Only, they appeared to be wet. The bowl was empty, so I figured the professor had made quite a considerable mess when he ate. I at least knew where the smell was coming from now. Whatever mental illness this once great academic was suffering from was beyond belief, and it was just now dawning on me how depressing it must have been for his family to see him that way. I opened the door wider, and as my eyes began to adjust to the darkness within, I saw his bed at the rear of the room. There was a large, dark patch in the middle. It must have been him. All I could hear was the sound of wet, labored mouth breathing and the faint thump of my own heartbeat. I reached in slowly, grasped the trolley, and pulled it towards me. The handle was wet, but I wanted out of that room, so I didn't care. I stepped back into the hallway, pulled the door shut, and bolted it. I breathed a sigh of relief before I looked down and nearly vomited in disgust. The trolley was indeed wet, but in the light of the hallway, I could see that it wasn't from the food. It was a thick, clear mucus. Day 3, it took a lot for me to return the next day. After the mucus on the trolley, I nearly ran right out of there. Elizabeth caught me at the bottom of the stairs, told me that I did everything adequately. She reassured me that the job would be worth my while, and that any future incidents involving mucus would lead me to be compensated financially, so I agreed to continue. The second and third meals were much like the first, except I brought some latex gloves with me when I was to retrieve the trolley. Puffin breast and turkey crowns, sausages and deshelled oysters. By all accounts, it was disgusting to look at. Frankly, I still can't believe the professor was able to eat it all. I figured that most of it was going to waste. As I stepped off the bus on Tuesday morning, Agnes was waiting by the door for me. She greeted me with a smile and welcomed me in. Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. I placed my phone inside the locker and started to prep the kitchen. Threw things into ovens, oiled some pans, etc. The first meal of the day was 3 whole chickens, an entire pork loin, and half a kilo of pickled cockles. For anyone who doesn't know what cockles are, they're like clams the size of your thumbnail. They're perfectly fine in small quantities, but a half kilo absolutely stinks out the whole kitchen, no matter what you do with them. Whoever is cleaning up after the professor, heaven help them. I carried the bowl up to the trolley, which had been cleaned before I arrived that morning, and tried not to gag at the sight of the meat sloppily rolling around inside it. I placed the bowl on top of the trolley and pushed it into position. I unbolted the door, and just like I had the day before, pushed it open slowly, making sure my hand was on the handle at all times. Quietly, the door glided into that horrid darkness. I could see the dark shape on the bed again, and hear the wet, labored breathing of the professor within. Suddenly, the door groaned as it came to the end of its swing. I froze. I had forgotten to lubricate the hinges. I didn't know what to do. I saw the professor glance towards me. He moved across the bed, only this time, instead of a slow, cumbersome slide, he almost sprang to his feet. My heart went cold as our eyes met from across the room. Two beads of white in the darkness were fixed on me, menacingly. I heard the clicking sound from the day before. It was coming from him. I pushed the trolley inside quickly as he made his approach towards me. I heard the clinking of metal mixed with the drag thump of his steps, the low groan and the clicking and the pounding of my heart, a symphony of horror that I would give anything not to hear. I staggered backwards awkwardly, too afraid to move any quicker, and suddenly felt a tightness in my chest as I was pulled backwards by the collar of my shirt. It was Agnes. She must have been watching me from the stairs and grabbed me just in time, but not before I caught my first glimpse of the professor in the light of the hallway. I saw only his leg as he stepped into the light, but it was enough to sicken me to my core. His skin was gray and hideously textured like the skin of a toad, with lumps and boils that glistened with an unknown moisture that seemed to cling to him like a film. I gasped as Agnes closed the door and drove the bolts home with a thud. As we stood outside of his room, I could hear the ravenous old man devouring that bowl of meat with an anger I hadn't heard before. He grunted and snarled as he went, like an animal territorial over its kill. Wet smacking sounds and the crunching of bones emanated from within that dark putrid room as Agnes and I stood together in silence. I glanced down at her, still breathing heavily and not knowing what to say. She had tears in her eyes as she looked at me. "He was a great man once," she said. And then she walked away. I took a walk outside. I needed some air. I checked my phone and my emails, but there was no response to any of the applications I had sent out the night before. I decided to take a longer break than I would normally, just so I could apply for as many jobs as possible. I expanded my search to 50 miles. I didn't care anymore. It had only been a few days, but it was enough. The whole situation with the professor was absolutely horrid. He needed help. He did not need me. I sent a few emails over the course of about 15 minutes, and then took a short walk amongst the trees. The air smelled of pine needles and the lake. I saw a few squirrels and some birds, and after a while, I was feeling a little better. I decided to head back to the house, and I did so begrudgingly, dawdling as I went. I empathized with the professor's family, mostly Agnes, if I'm being honest. She was clearly shaken by the whole situation, and wasn't in any position to do anything about it. As I approached the house, I glanced upwards towards what I guessed would be the professor's room. It was quite high up, despite being on the first floor. The only room with the curtains fully drawn. Even from the outside, it was clear that the windows were absolutely filthy. As though a fire had been lit within the room, the glass was blackened and smeared with grime. I didn't want to think of what it might be. The thought would likely make me puke. As I was staring at the window, I noticed one of the curtains was moving. It swayed a little, then became still. Suddenly a hand appeared on the glass, black and wet in the grime, then another beside it. I couldn't really see, but somehow I knew the professor was staring at me at that moment, peeking through the filth with both hands pressed to the window, much in the way a child does. Then the curtain twitched again, and the hands disappeared back into the dark. I went back inside and cleaned the kitchen. There was still no sign of Elizabeth, and Agnes was pottering around in one of the sitting rooms. Above me, I could hear the drag thump of Professor Ismay's steps, and occasionally a loud bang, almost as though he was jumping around up there. After a while, it stopped. The next meal was 10 lobster tails. 2 pounds of beef mince, a whole duck, and escargot. As I left at the end of the day, I glanced back up towards the professor's window. I wondered how he had come to be this way, and how had it began. What could topple a man from the heights of intellectual achievement down to this monstrous existence? It was then, as I was taking one last look at his window, I realized something. The 2 handprints had the thumb on the same side. Day 4. Before I had left my house that morning, I received a text from Elizabeth. It read, "Good morning. No need to come in today. I'm afraid my father is unwell. You will still be paid, so don't worry. Return to work tomorrow as normal. Thank you." I really did not mind at all. I would have the perfect opportunity to head into the village and try to find another job. I'd take all day doing it too if I had to. I took the bus and a couple of CVs with me, handing them out here and there. To my surprise, any of the pubs or small cafes I visited seemed to react quite negatively towards me. Some refused my CV altogether. I didn't understand. That was until I ran into a friend of mine, or at least a former friend of mine. I was just exiting a newsagent when I ran into him. A man called Lionel. "Long time no see," I said. "Yeah," he said flatly, "excuse me." He tried to get by me, his face almost expressionless, as if he had no time for me at all. "Lionel?" I said, tapping his arm. "What?" he snapped back. "You all right?" "I'm fine, mate. You all right?" There was a hint of anger in his voice this time. Something was going on. "Lionel, are you mad at me or something?" I asked. "Are you taking the piss?" he fired back. A few people on the street were staring now. Lionel looked absolutely livid about something. "What's going on, mate?" I asked. "What's going on?" he snapped. "You are taking the piss. Fuck off, you disgusting prick." And with that, he went inside. I had known Lionel for about 2 years at that point. He was a chef too, so we knew each other through work. I waited for him outside the newsagent while he shopped inside. Across the street was a small coffee house. Inside, I could see people pointing at me, talking between themselves. The barista was scowling at me. As Lionel stepped back into the street, he groaned when he saw me waiting. "Lionel," I said loudly. He had begun to walk away at speed, but I kept pace with him. "Lionel!" "What the fuck is going on?" Suddenly he spun around. There was a fire in his eyes. I'd never seen him like this before. He looked me up and down as though he was observing something alien and disgusting to him. Then he spat at my feet. "Kids?" he yelled. "Kids? What are you talking about?" He punched me in the face and I staggered backwards. My nose was bleeding, and when I looked up, he was walking away. I never saw him again after that. I felt unwell the rest of the day. There was a metallic taste in the back of my mouth and I had a headache. I popped into a small supermarket that I knew had a deli sandwich bar in the back. I had one last CV, so I figured I'd try there too. The manager took one look at me and shook his head. "Why?" I asked bluntly. "Are you joking?" he replied. I looked behind me as I heard some commotion and could see someone pointing a security guard in my direction. It was as though the whole world had turned against me, and I didn't know why. "Why won't you accept my CV?" I asked loudly. "I've got kids of my own, you know. Lots of folk in here do. Those pictures have been going around, you know. What chance did you think you have?" I heard the approach of footsteps, boots squeaking on the tile floor. "What have I done? Why won't anyone hire me?" I cried. A hand grasped my shoulder, and a deep voice commanded me to leave with him. As I was pulled away, the man behind the bar shook his head and turned away. The security guard, who was not gentle when he pushed me outside, stood in the doorway blocking me from re-entering. I could feel tears forming and a lump in the back of my throat as I headed towards the bus station. I reached the stop and it began to rain. Beside me, a bunch of teenagers came to stand beneath the shelter to escape the weather, and when they noticed me, they began to chatter amongst themselves, laughing and whispering. I heard one of them say, "That's him." Another one called me a pedophile. I walked home in the rain, hiding my face beneath the hood of my coat. I'll post the rest tomorrow. Just thinking about that day makes me feel unwell. The Transformation of Professor Ismay, Part 2. Day 5. I had spent most of the night before crying and confused. I texted a few people that I thought were my friends, and most either ignored me or had blocked me completely. Only one replied. To put it briefly, There was a rumor going around that I had done something highly inappropriate with the food I'd prepared for one of my previous clients' children. There was also a photo circulating of me wearing nothing but an apron while I worked a barbecue in a small garden. Needless to say, the rumors are completely false. The picture, while genuine, is one that was taken while I was in the army. I was at a garden party with a few of my squad mates, and things got a little silly. You know how it is. For some reason, the picture is being circulated along with the rumor, and apparently, most people are simply accepting it as a fact. To make matters worse, the family I have apparently committed this crime against have moved away, so I have no way of defending myself or rebutting the claims. It seemed that whoever was spreading these lies was either trying to get me killed, arrested, or thrown out of town. No one would hire me. No one wanted to even speak to me. Frankly, I was lucky that not everyone was adept at social media and was still able to buy my food and household supplies from people that the rumor hadn't quite reached. I couldn't afford to leave town just yet, and there was nowhere for me to turn. I had only one choice. I returned to the Ismay house as requested, and was met with Elizabeth at the doorway. She did not smile, but welcomed me into the house nonetheless, closing the door behind me. Days 6 to 14, as I had in the days previous, I prepared, cooked, and served Professor Ismay's bowls of meat 3 times a day. Elizabeth never mentioned the rumor about me, nor did she seem to care if she knew. Agnes never said anything about it either. She was always nearby, it seemed, always watching and listening. I could never tell if she was there to watch over me or spy on me for Elizabeth. The camera in the kitchen would follow me as I moved around. When I was filling the professor's bowl or scrubbing the pots and pans afterwards, its gaze was fixed. The professor seemed to walk around his room less and less as the days went on. Sometimes when I would deliver the trolley, he wouldn't move at all. And on a few occasions, I would retrieve the trolley with the bowl either untouched or only partially disturbed. Elizabeth told me to simply toss the scraps into the lake for the wildlife. The fish and the freshwater eels never left any scraps. On the 3rd Monday, everything changed. Day 15. That morning, as I was walking towards the house, I noticed that one of the windows in the professor's room was cracked. The glass was still in the frame, but there was a circular break in the pane, as though it had been struck by a rock or a ball, somewhere in the middle. What surprised me, however, was that the glass was broken outward, meaning that the impact had come from the inside. When I asked Agnes what had happened, she simply shook her head and said she didn't know. I didn't believe her. I didn't see Elizabeth the whole morning, and began my duties as I had done every day for the previous 2 weeks. The first meal was especially sordid. Chicken livers, fresh crab, pheasant, pork tongue, and black pudding. The crabs were to be served in their shells. I lubricated the hinges to the professor's door and unbolted it, and then paused for a second to listen for any movement. I couldn't hear anything, so I pushed open the door. As it swung into the room, I heard the loud clicking sound that he had been making more and more. It was slightly different this time, though. It was a little higher pitch and a little quicker. I peered into the room, scanning for any sign of the professor. There was no movement that I could see, so I wheeled the trolley inside. I decided to take a moment before I rang the bell. I thought I might steal another look at him. I hadn't alerted him yet. At least, I didn't think so anyway. If I needed to, I could get out before he was off the bed. He was old after all, and I was pretty fit. I glanced around, squinting in the darkness, trying to make sense of any shape that might be there. I couldn't see much. After an uncomfortable 30 seconds or so, I rang the bell, and then slowly backed out of the room, still glancing around for any sign that he was there. I closed the door, bolted it, and listened. Absolute silence. I waited for a minute or so, listening with my ear pressed against the door. I couldn't hear anything at all. I figured that he was probably asleep. Before long, I gave up waiting and set off down the stairs. When I was about halfway down, I heard the loudest crash I'd ever heard up until that point come from inside his room. I fell against the banister in shock, expecting the wall to have come down behind me. Agnes came trotting as fast as she could from the front sitting room, and she looked on in disgust as we heard the terrible animalistic feeding of the professor upstairs. I'd bumped my head a little when I fell against the banister, and when I rubbed it, my hand was wet. At first, I thought it was blood, but it wasn't. A shiver ran down my spine. It was a semi-transparent white mucus. He had been above me in that room. He must have. A few feet, or a few inches? I wasn't sure, but he'd been there. Right above my head. "Are you all right?" Agnes asked. I don't remember what I'd said to her. I was in shock. I stumbled into the kitchen and washed my hair in the sink. The mucus was revolting. It stunk like you wouldn't believe, and it was difficult to remove. It clung to me like glue. An hour passed, and then another. I sat in the kitchen scrubbing the pans slowly, prolonging the inevitable. The camera never left me, and eventually Agnes came into the kitchen. "It's time, my love," she said softly. "What is wrong with Professor Ismay, Agnes?" I asked. "He is unwell. Tell me the truth." She looked uncomfortable. She interlocked her fingers, and I could see her lip wavering. "I don't know," she said softly. As I finished washing the knife I'd used to cut the chicken livers, I wrapped it in a dishcloth to dry it and slipped it into my apron as stealthily as I could manage. I don't think Agnes noticed, although I was unsure about the camera. I didn't care, though. I wasn't going back into that room without it. Agnes followed me up the stairs and stood with me as I lubricated the hinges of the door. I unbolted it and allowed it to swing open. I felt my heart sink. For the first time, the trolley was not where I had left it. It was further into the room, and it was lying on its side. The bowl was nowhere to be seen. "What do I do now?" I whispered. "Your job, my love." Agnes whispered back. In any other circumstance, I might have taken her reply as a snarky remark or an attempt to belittle me with sarcasm. But there was a sadness in her voice and her eyes, and I knew that she was not telling me what to do, but asking me to help with what she could not. The faint hush of rain on the manor house's many roofs began above us, like ever-present TV static in the air. I could hear it on the windows as I stepped inside. The first thing I did was check above the door. I heard Agnes stifle a whimper as I looked, and at that moment, I'd like to think that we both understood not only the gravity of the situation, but that we were on the same page regarding the professor's condition. Professor Ismay didn't seem to be there, nor was he on his bed when I looked. There was a foul stench emanating from the back corners of the room as I stepped further and further in. It was sour in the air and struck the back of my throat like hot needles. I glanced behind. There was about 20 feet of open space behind me at this point. I'd never been this far in before. The carpet beneath my feet was wet and sticky, and every footstep felt as though I was walking on a thick layer of mud. I reached the trolley and knelt down to grab it. As quietly as I could manage, I stood it upright and gave it a slight pull. It moved well enough. The wheels weren't damaged or seized in any way, but there was no sign of the bowl. As I started to walk backwards, I heard the clicking of the professor from somewhere beside me. From behind the curtains to my right, a huge black shape lunged at me, clicking and trilling as though in ecstasy at the success of its trap. I could only scream. I fell backwards as the slimy, filth-ridden body of the professor slammed into me. He was groaning and screeching, producing sounds that humans simply should not be able to make. The curtain that had hidden him was now on the floor, the rod having been pulled from the wall. In what little light that broke through the grime-covered windows, I could see that the professor's skin was black all over, the texture of which was now more crocodilian than toad, but still coated in that same mucus-like slime I had seen last time I had caught a glimpse of him. I screamed and tried to claw away, but he was monstrously strong and held me in place. His nails dug into my skin as he lunged for my neck. In the scuffle, I saw his face. It was contorted and stretched, as though his skull was too large for the skin attached to it. His eyes were swollen and dead-looking, surrounded almost entirely by smaller black orbs that covered the entire top half of his head. His mouth was contorted into a sort of tube-like shape, with his teeth on the outside, circling the proboscis that was once his lower jaw. I tried to grab his hands to pull him off, but they were so wet and slimy that I couldn't get a grip on them. His elongated mouth snapped at my face and neck, finding my ear as I turned away. His teeth clamped down as I screamed in pain. Suddenly I remembered the knife. I could hear Agnes crying and screaming as I pulled it from my apron and jammed it into the professor's shoulder. He let out a shrill cry, and for a moment his grip loosened. I managed to pull away and clamber to my feet. I ran for the door and dived onto the floor at Agnes's feet. I caught one last glimpse of the professor before Agnes locked him inside his room. He was at least 7 feet tall, and there was some sort of gigantic growth on his back, almost as though he wore a backpack beneath his skin. The malformed professor shrieked banshee-like as Agnes slammed the door, drove the bolts home, and immediately started wailing. Blood ran down my neck. It didn't hurt too bad after the initial bite, at least not right away. I remember being so full of adrenaline that I could barely stand or form words. Inside, the professor, or whatever he now was screeching and screaming and clawing at the door like an enraged animal robbed of its quarry. Agnes held the door handle and kept repeating the same thing over and over. No more, no more, please God, no more. I need an ambulance, I remember saying. I could hardly speak. When I stood, my legs were like jelly. I left Agnes crying by the door and stumbled down the stairs as fast as I could. I felt faint and very, very sick. Through a crack in the doorway to the front sitting room, I noticed a mobile phone on the arm of a chair by the window. I made my way to it, and as I picked it up, I began to feel weak in my knees. I could hear banging upstairs, Agnes's horrid lamentations and banging that wouldn't cease. I swiped to unlock the phone. It was Elizabeth's. I hadn't seen her at all that day, but her phone was right there. I tried calling the police, but when it connected, I couldn't formulate my sentences properly. I was feeling dizzy, and I'm sure I was slurring when I spoke. I remember calling 2 or 3 times, but either they kept hanging up or I did. I don't really remember. I can only assume that I must have been completely unintelligible on the other end. There was more banging, louder and louder. Agnes began calling my name. "John, John," she cried. "John, I can't." In all the commotion, I somehow noticed that Elizabeth only had 4 apps on her home screen: contacts, messages, calls, and gallery. I don't know why, but I clicked on the gallery app. In the screenshot section, I noticed a familiar photo. It was me at the barbecue. There was a loud crash upstairs. Agnes screamed gutturally. "John, he's... I fell between the chair and the wall and passed out. Day 16. When I woke up, it was dark. Very dark. There were a few lamps on in the room, but somehow there was an overwhelming blackness that seemed to surround me, ignoring all light. I was lying behind the chair where I'd fallen, Elizabeth's phone still in my hand. I checked the time, and it said 03:49. I panicked and tried to stand. My back and my arm were killing me, and my head was still a little swimmy from the fall. The house was quiet. There was no sound whatsoever, except for the rain that ceaselessly beat at the windows. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was confused and scared. I hadn't really processed what had happened earlier. I'm not sure I ever will. I stepped out into the foyer, rubbing my head, and glanced up the stairs. I couldn't see anything or hear any noise, but I could feel that the professor was up there. Up there somewhere in his room, skulking about in his filth in the dark. "Agnes?" I whispered. Nothing. "Elizabeth?" Still nothing. I headed towards the kitchen. The light was still on from earlier, and somehow that made me feel more safe. Every child knows that monsters can't get them if they have a nightlight. I guess that feeling never truly leaves us. I kept thinking that I might hear footsteps or see Agnes appear from around some corner at any moment, but there was nothing. I don't think I've ever felt more alone than I did at that moment. I headed into the kitchen and turned on the tap for the sink. I let the water run through my fingers and washed my hands. I cupped 2 handfuls and passed them over my head, then took a few handfuls to drink. I needed to get out of the house while I still could. To hell with the money. To hell with all of it. I looked up at the camera, and to my surprise, it was active. But it wasn't looking at me. It was looking at the fridges behind me. When I looked at where the camera was pointing, I'm not ashamed to admit that I lost control of myself. I could feel my leg becoming warm as I noticed the great wet streaks across the door of the fridge and the clumps of mucus that rolled slowly down the handle of the door. Surprisingly, my first thought wasn't to run, though it certainly should have been. I thought about Agnes. I needed to know if she was all right. She had pulled me to safety once before. I couldn't leave without at least looking for her. I took 2 knives from a large block near the sink. I placed one in the front pouch of my apron and held the other out in front of me. I peered through the doorway of the kitchen into the foyer. The professor wasn't there, not from what I could see anyway. I entered slowly, making sure to keep looking up and around, checking the corners and the ceiling. The wind and rain outside were thrashing violently. Somewhere far away, I heard the low rumble of thunder. I began up the stairs, taking one step at a time, slowly, into the ever-darker stairwell. The light at the top of the stairs was out. Whether it was broken or turned off, I could not tell. I could smell the professor's room from halfway up. As his doorway came into view, I could see that it was flung wide open. The door itself was intact mostly, but the bolts were ripped clean off. As I reached the top of the stairs, I peered round the corner and down the hallway towards the other rooms of the first floor. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. Beside me on the floor, there was a dark shape. I watched it for a moment, my heart beating wildly. It didn't seem to be moving. I'd stood outside this door several times over the last 2 weeks, and I was sure there was a light switch somewhere nearby. I felt for it along the wall, keeping my knife hand ready just in case. After a while, my fingers found something hard. I pushed down, and a soft amber glow lit up the hallway. I had to stifle my scream. Agnes' body lay at my feet. Her face was battered and bloody, and the underside of her forearms were torn to shreds. Whatever the professor did to her, he had mangled her badly. I remembered her voice calling my name before I passed out, and tears began to fill my eyes. That's when I heard the clicking again. It was behind me, somewhere down the stairs. I turned to look, and sure enough, the professor was in the foyer. He was staring at his own portrait on the wall with an animalistic curiosity. He hadn't seen me yet, so I moved as quickly and as quietly as I could around the corner at the top of the stairs. I couldn't help but watch him, his grotesque, inhuman form staring at the visage of what he once was, never to be again. His proboscis made little clicking sounds as his lips and teeth rattled together, as though he was speaking to himself in a language that only he could understand. He still carried the knife in his shoulder where I had stabbed him, but the large growth on his back was gone. Where it once had been, there were 4 spindly appendages sprouting from the center of his back. They looked as though they had unfurled, let's say. They were wet and dripping with mucus, twitching and drooping like vines from a great rotten willow. From below his left arm, there came yet another arm, protruding from the ribs. It had at some point burst through his skin and was curled up in front of his body, much in the way a dinosaur's arm would be. His skin was a black mess of growths and boils, scale-like and stretched beyond measure. There was no other way to describe it. It looked to be pulled taut over his enormous, inhuman figure, and when he moved it would tear and rip. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't get by him, and I couldn't stay put either. I looked on in horror as he pressed his hands to the wall and suddenly began to walk up it with ease. At that moment, I did the only thing I could think to do. I stepped back into his room and slowly closed the door. I didn't think he'd seen me. It was a wonder he hadn't found me when I was downstairs. I reached around on the wall for a light switch and found one fairly quickly. I pressed it and a series of lamps came on somewhere behind me. I knew before I turned around that whatever was in that room was going to be nothing short of horrifying. I didn't want to see it, but I didn't want the professor coming in after me either. So I picked up a small table, not unlike the one in the hallway outside, and wedged it beneath the handle of the door, locking me in and hopefully locking him out. I took a second to prepare myself, then I turned around. I am not a religious person, but if there is a hell, it is without a doubt the bedroom of Professor Ismay. What was once most likely a regular bedroom was now a repulsive flesh pit. The floor, walls, and even parts of the ceiling were coated in a thick, wet mass of what looked like rotting meat and excrement. The bed was a mound of brown filth that rose from the hellish coagulate around it, like some abhorrent plinth from which to rain over the rancid desecration the professor had created. Black hand and footprints showed signs of his travels across the ceiling and walls. Bones were strewn about the place, and amongst the various carcasses of chickens and other rotten fowl, there spawned thousands upon thousands of maggots that gyrated and pulsed in grotesque little gatherings. I threw up. Despite all this, the most disturbing things in that room were the orbs. Collected in small piles in various places across the rear of the room, dozens and dozens of white orbs rested in groups upon the filth. They were glossy and white, like billiard balls held together by some sort of membranous slime. Upon closer inspection, the orbs seemed to be dark inside, though I dared not touch them to find out why. I had a pretty good idea anyway. I sat in that room for about 20 minutes. I just didn't know what to do. I tried praying but gave up quickly. I needed to get out of the house, but there was only one way out of that room. I had first thought to break the window, but when I looked closer at where the professor had made his attempt, I saw that the glass was imbued with a metal wire mesh. Without a few power tools, I couldn't go through the window no matter what I did. I knew I was going to have to go back through the house, but that meant trying to get by him. I trudged through the slime and pressed my ear to the splinter-ridden door. I could hear the clicking out there and the faint, wet thud of his footsteps. He was nearby, but it sounded as though he was moving away. If I could get to the top of the stairs, I could see the front door. And if I could get to the door, I might have a chance. I slowly moved the table away from the door. I could hear his footsteps again, but they were faint this time. I thought he might be in the kitchen or somewhere near there. I held the knife at stomach height and switched off the lights. Then I slowly opened the door. There was absolute silence, and then suddenly a loud whirring sound came from somewhere in the house, like someone had fired up a grass trimmer. I froze and listened. It only lasted a few seconds before it stopped, and then it began again, this time much louder and for a longer period. He was moving closer. I heard the wet thwacks of his footsteps, and he entered the foyer, and when I saw him I realized what I had just been hearing. The long drooping appendages hanging from his back were unfurled and flat. They were wings like those of a dragonfly, long and transparent, with thick veins running through them that pulsed with a black fluid. They would twitch occasionally and then fire up again. In the open space of the foyer, the echoing sound was tremendous. I watched in awe at the sight of him, grotesque as he was. What had he become? My amazement quickly changed when he turned my way. He saw me. I felt with every fiber of my being the way I imagine any prey animal feels when faced with a superior predator. He clicked and trilled, regarded me curiously for a moment, then jumped into the air towards me. His wings sprung to life and began that tremendous buzzing once more. I ran deeper into the house, down the long hallway of the first floor. I had never been further than the professor's room before. Each door was as unknown to me as the last. I could hear his terrible wings close behind me, then the wet thumping of his hands and feet as he clung to the ceiling above. I turned a corner and kept running, hitting a large white door at the end of the hallway. I pulled it open and was suddenly thrown inside by the force of the professor, crashing into the door moments later. I pulled the handle towards me and managed to find a small bolt lock just above it. Something was hitting me in the face in the dark, something small. When I pulled at it, a light came on above. I was in a small washroom. There was a toilet, a sink, and a small window on the back wall. The professor was pounding and scratching on the door, desperate to get inside. I was hyperventilating, sweating profusely, and my heart threatened to break through my chest. In my desperation, I tried speaking to him. "Professor Ismay," I called out. He either didn't hear me, or he did. I wasn't sure which one was worse. He just kept attacking the door with a fury that I had never thought possible. I knew the wooden door wouldn't last much longer, and once he got through, I was surely going to die. Suddenly, I remembered the window behind me. The fall might be the end of me, but it was a chance that I was going to have to take. I climbed on the toilet, unlatched the window, and peered down at the ground below. It was a long drop, but I would probably live. I passed my legs through first, holding on to the windowsill with my elbows. I saw the door bounce in the frame. I lowered myself down so that I was hanging by my fingers, and then let go. I hit the muddy ground hard and cried out. I was immediately soaked by the rain, and I was pretty sure that I had broken my ankles. I was in terrible pain, but I was out. I was free. I crawled. I crawled on my belly, using my arms to pull me through the mud until I reached the tree line. I couldn't hear Professor Ismay anymore, but he was quite far away at that point. I kept on, crawling and crawling until my arms and hands were bloody and caked in dirt, until I had worn holes in my trousers and caused my knees to bleed. I crawled through the early morning rain until I reached the road on the other side of the woods and fell out into the oncoming path of two bright lights. They stopped in front of me, and I heard nothing but the rain. I shielded my face from the light as someone stood over me. They tried to speak to me, but I couldn't understand them. The house, I said weakly. Then I passed out as the sound of their voice became muffled and distorted. Day 1723, I was taken to hospital in the early hours of that morning. A truck driver had found me on the road. Nearly ran me over, apparently. I have lacerations on my head, though they are not too serious. Both my ankles are broken, as I expected them to be, and I have multiple cuts and bruises from my crawl through the woods. I have spoken with doctors and police officers about what I have seen at that house. I told them about the meals I was making, about Elizabeth and Agnes. At length, I told them about Professor Ismay. You might not be surprised to hear that they didn't believe me. I was placed under observation by some head doctor or whatever. They told me that I was going to stay at the hospital for a little while so they could keep an eye on me. One of the police officers was kind enough to fetch a few things from my house, mostly some clothes, my toothbrush, and this laptop I'm using. I've spoken with one or two officers a few times now. They told me that they found Elizabeth Ismay dead in her bedroom. She had apparently taken her own life, leaving some sort of note expressing shame or guilt about her father's condition. They found Agnes at the top of the stairs, though they wouldn't say how they were treating her death. They also found the professor's room. When I asked them about Professor Ismay, they said they hadn't found him. At least, not all of him. They claimed to have found what they said were folds of skin and hair in the hallway of the first floor. The bathroom door had been destroyed, and there was a strange footprint on the toilet seat that they couldn't identify. This brings us up to now. It's been 23 days since I went to that house looking for a job. My life will never be the same. I can't say that I understand what happened to Professor Ismay or why it was allowed to go on for so long. I know I played a part in it, and for that, I will forever be ashamed of myself. Sometimes when I'm asleep at night, I can hear the terrible thunderous buzzing of his wings and the gnashing of his teeth. I wake in cold sweats with my heart pounding. I can never tell if it's a dream or if it's real. I don't really want to know. The police won't tell me anything more. I don't know what's to become of the house or the sordid contents within. All I know is that when I eventually leave this place, I'll move somewhere far away. I'll keep one eye on the sky and a knife in my back pocket, just in case.